The sound of a gunshot cracked through the morning air, jolting Caleb Sullivan from sleep. His weathered hand reached instinctively for the rifle he kept beside his bed, fingers closing around the cold metal before his eyes had fully opened. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied him as his mind struggled to separate nightmare from reality. Another shot rang out, this one unmistakably real. Caleb moved swiftly through the cabin, his stockinged feet silent against the wooden floorboards. Years of military training had never left his muscles, even if he tried to leave everything else behind. At the front door, he paused, listening. The wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the promise of more snow, but underneath it he heard voices. A woman shout, high and angry. He eased the door open just enough to see Eleanor Wilson standing on his porch, her arms spread protectively as if to shield the doorway behind her where her children slept. Her auburn hair whipped around her face in the bitter wind, but she stood tall, unwavering despite the pistol aimed at her chest. "I'm telling you, I'm not Victoria!" Eleanor's voice carried clearly through the frigid air. The woman holding the gun stood at the bottom of the porch steps, her face a harder version of Eleanor's, eyes narrowed against the swirling snow. "Don't play games with me. Where's the money? We had a deal." Eleanor's shoulders straightened. "My name is Eleanor Wilson. I've never been to Helena, and I've never robbed anything in my life." The woman's laugh was cold as the air around them. "Still playing the grieving widow? That act worked on those fools at the bank. But I know better." Caleb watched as the woman's finger tightened on the trigger. He had seconds, nothing more. 3 days earlier, the afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rolling hills of Pinewood Ranch. Autumn had painted the landscape in rich golds and deep reds, but the beauty was tempered by the dark clouds gathering to the north, harbingers of the first winter storm. Caleb Sullivan stood by the wooden fence at the edge of his property, absently running a calloused hand over its rough surface as he squinted down the dirt road that led from town. "She's late," Samuel Eagleton observed, his gravelly voice carrying from where he sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of pine with practiced strokes. At 68, the old ranch hand moved slower than he once had, but his eye missed nothing. "Stage could be delayed," Caleb replied, not turning around. "Weather's turning." He'd read Rebecca Mitchell's letters so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. A 30-year-old widow from Boston with a sensible view of marriage and no children to complicate matters. Her neat, precise handwriting had revealed a practical woman who understood what he was offering. Not romance, but partnership. A chance to build something lasting in this remote corner of Montana, far from whatever sorrows had marked her past. Caleb had shaved carefully that morning, wincing as the straight razor revealed the long scar that ran from temple to jaw along his left cheek, a permanent reminder of an Apache blade that had nearly taken his life during his time as an Army Scout. He'd donned his only good shirt, a faded blue cotton garment that Samuel insisted made him look less like a grizzly and more like a gentleman. At 42, Caleb harbored no illusions about his appearance. Years of hard living had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, and the Montana sun had weathered his skin to leather. But he offered stability, a productive ranch, and the promise that Rebecca would never go hungry or unprotected. It seemed enough in their correspondence. A wisp of dust on the horizon caught his attention. Samuel saw it too, heaving himself to his feet with a grunt. "Reckon that's the stage," the old man said, tucking his knife and half-finished carving into his pocket. "Best put on your welcoming face, such as it is." Caleb straightened, suddenly aware of how his palms had grown damp despite the chill in the air. He'd faced Apache raiders and survived blizzards that had claimed stronger men, yet the prospect of meeting his mail-order bride sent a flutter of unease through his stomach. What if her letters had misrepresented her? What if his had misrepresented him? The stagecoach appeared over the rise, the team of 4 horses laboring against the rutted road. Flakes of early snow had begun to fall, melting as they touched the ground, but promising more to come. The driver's shout to the horses carried on the wind as the coach drew closer, wheels grinding to a halt before the ranch house. Caleb stepped forward, one hand reflexively smoothing his shirt, while the other moved to ensure his hat sat properly on his head. The stage door swung open, and the driver climbed down to assist the passengers. "Pinewood Ranch," the driver announced, reaching in to help someone descend. Last stop before the weather turns, folks. Better hurry. A slender woman emerged, her dark blue traveling dress dusty from the journey, a woolen shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders against the wind. Her hair was a rich auburn, not the blonde Caleb had expected from Rebecca's description, and when she turned toward him, he saw eyes of clear gray instead of the blue he'd anticipated. Before he could process this discrepancy, a boy of about 16 clambered down after her, followed by a girl perhaps 2 years younger. The driver reached in again, helping two identical young boys who appeared to be around 8. Finally, the woman turned back to receive a small child, a golden-haired girl no more than 4 years old, who immediately buried her face in her mother's neck. Caleb stood frozen, his greeting dying unspoken on his lips. This was not Rebecca Mitchell. This was not one woman but 6 people, a mother and 5 children, standing before him with expressions ranging from exhaustion to wariness. The woman approached slowly, uncertainty in her step but determination in her gaze. "Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, her voice soft but stiff-hidden. Caleb nodded, unable to find words. "I'm Eleanor Wilson," she said, shifting the small child in her arms. "I believe you were expecting someone else." Samuel moved to stand beside Caleb, his weathered face showing surprise but none of the consternation Caleb felt churning within. "Rebecca Mitchell," Caleb finally managed. "I was expecting Rebecca Mitchell." Eleanor nodded, her expression apologetic but not ashamed. "I met Miss Mitchell at the Denver station. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "She gave me this, your advertisement." Caleb took the paper, recognizing his own careful wording, requesting a practical woman of good character to share in the running of his Montana ranch. The paper had been torn from a newspaper, the edges ragged, but his name and the ranch's location were clearly visible. "Miss Mitchell had a change of heart," Eleanor continued, her voice growing quieter as she glanced at her children. "She met a timber merchant at the station who was bound for Oregon. They seemed quite taken with each other." The oldest boy moved protectively closer to his mother. "We've used nearly everything we had to get here," he said, his young voice trying to sound older than his years. "Mother said you were looking for help with your ranch." "Noah," Eleanor admonished gently, though her eyes held a flicker of pride at her son's courage. A gust of bitter wind swept across the yard, causing the little girl to whimper and burrow deeper into her mother's embrace. The twin boys huddled closer together, their small faces pinched with cold. "Storm's coming in fast," Samuel observed, his eyes on the darkening northern sky. "First big one of the season, by the look of it." Caleb felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes upon him, waiting for his decision. This was not what he had planned, not remotely what he had paid for. He had wanted a wife, not a ready-made family with 5 children and whatever complications they would bring. Yet as he looked at their travel-worn faces, at the quiet dignity with which Eleanor stood, despite her clear exhaustion, he found he could not turn them away. Not with night falling and a blizzard approaching. "You can stay until the weather clears," he said finally, his voice gruffer than he intended. "There's room in the house." Relief softened Eleanor's features, though she maintained her composure. "We won't be a burden, Mr. Sullivan. We can work for our keep." The little girl in her arms coughed then, a deep, rattling sound that seemed too harsh for such a small body. "Sophie's been fighting a cold since Denver," Eleanor explained, concern creasing her brow. "The mountain air." Samuel stepped forward, his usual gruffness tempered with unexpected gentleness. "Let's get you folks inside where it's warm. Storm like this coming, you wouldn't make it halfway back to town anyway." As Samuel led the way, the Wilson family followed, the children casting curious glances at Caleb as they passed. Eleanor paused before him, the last to enter. "Thank you," she said simply, her gray eyes meeting his directly. "I know this isn't what you agreed to." Caleb nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond to the quiet strength he saw in her face. This woman had traveled hundreds of miles with 5 children on the strength of a torn newspaper advertisement in a stranger's redirect. Either she was remarkably brave or remarkably desperate, perhaps both. As he followed them inside, snowflakes began to fall more heavily, no longer melting when they touched the earth. Caleb's home, while spacious by frontier standards, had never felt as small as it did that evening. The main room, with its large stone fireplace and sturdy handcrafted furniture, echoed with unfamiliar voices and movements after years of housing just two men. Samuel showed Eleanor and her daughters to the spare bedroom at the back of the house, while the boys would sleep in the small study that Caleb had converted from a storage room years ago. Caleb himself retreated to the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the family settling in. Children's questions, Eleanor's soft, patient answers, the creak of floorboards under unfamiliar feet. "Never thought I'd see the day," Samuel murmured as he joined Caleb, reaching for the coffee pot warming on the stove. "6 people under this roof makes a change." Caleb grunted, leaning against the counter and staring out the small window where snow now fell steadily, erasing the landscape under a blanket of white. "Not what I bargained for." "Life rarely gives us exactly what we bargained for," Samuel replied, his roomy eyes twinkling with unexpected humor. "Sometimes it gives us what we need instead." Before Caleb could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her shawl discarded and her sleeves rolled up. She had pinned her hair back from her face, revealing a graceful neck and the gentle curve of her cheek. "I'd like to prepare supper, if I may," she said. "It's the least I can do for your hospitality." Caleb opened his mouth to refuse. This was his house, after all. But Samuel spoke first. "Kitchen's all yours, ma'am. Pantry's through there, root cellars accessible from the back porch. We're simple eaters, but there's plenty." Eleanor nodded her thanks and moved with quiet efficiency, quickly familiarizing herself with the kitchen's layout. Caleb watched, slightly bemused, as she transformed from weary traveler to capable homemaker before his eyes. Her movements were economical, practiced, as she assembled ingredients and built a meal from what she found. The oldest girl, Emma, he'd heard Eleanor call her, appeared to help, setting the large oak table with the mismatched plates and utensils Caleb had accumulated over the years. The boys were sent to wash up, and soon the house was filled with the rich aroma of stew and baking bread that Eleanor had somehow produced from his modest supplies. Dinner was a strange affair for Caleb, who had grown accustomed to quiet meals with only Samuel's occasional comments to break the silence. The Wilson children, though clearly taught good manners, brought a new energy to the table. The twins, Oliver and Ethan, whispered to each other between careful bites. Emma helped Sophie with her food, cutting meat into tiny pieces for the little girl, whose cough had subsided somewhat in the warmth of the house. Noah, the oldest, ate silently, his eyes frequently darting to Caleb with undisguised assessment. The boy had his mother's coloring but a square jaw and broader shoulders that hinted at the man he would become. His protective stance toward his family was evident in the way he positioned himself between them and Caleb, as if ready to intervene should the need arise. Conversation was minimal and carefully polite. Eleanor asked appropriate questions about the ranch, its size, the livestock, the typical seasonal work, while skillfully deflecting queries about her own circumstances. Caleb noted this but didn't press. Whatever had driven a widow with 5 children to pursue such an uncertain future wasn't his concern, as long as they moved on once the weather cleared. After the meal, as Eleanor and Emma cleared the dishes, Sophie tugged at her mother's skirt. "Story time, Mama?" the little girl asked, her voice slightly hoarse from her cough. Eleanor smoothed her daughter's golden curls. "Yes, sweetheart, as soon as we're finished here." "I'll take care of this," Emma offered, taking the dishcloth from her mother's hands. "You look tired, Mother." Eleanor smiled gratefully at her eldest daughter, then gathered Sophie into her arms. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for sharing your home tonight," she said, her eyes meeting Caleb's briefly, before she carried Sophie toward their temporary quarters, the twins following close behind. Noah lingered, helping Emma with the dishes despite Caleb's assurance that it wasn't necessary. The boy's determined assistance seemed less about helpfulness and more about establishing his role in the family hierarchy. He was the man of the family now, his every movement declared, and he would not shirk his duties. Caleb retreated to the front porch, needing air despite the cold. The snow had intensified, large flakes swirling in the wind and accumulating rapidly on the ground. Already several inches had fallen, and the sky promised much more to come. The Wilson family wouldn't be leaving anytime soon, he realized. The thought unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite define. Samuel joined him, lighting his pipe and puffing thoughtfully as they both gazed out at the thickening snowfall. "Going to be a bad one," the old man observed. "Might be stuck here for days, maybe a week." Caleb nodded, his breath fogging in the cold air. Don't have much choice. Samuel studied his employer and friend of 15 years. That boy, Noah, he reminds me of someone. Can't quite place it. Caleb had noticed it too, though he said nothing. There was something familiar in the set of Noah's jaw, in the watchful intelligence of his eyes. Well, Samuel said, knocking his pipe against the railing to clear it, I'm turning in. Tomorrow will come early, snow or no snow. Left alone, Caleb remained on the porch until the cold drove him inside. The house had grown quiet, the children presumably asleep. As he moved through the main room, banking the fire for the night, he noticed a small leather bag that had been left beside one of the chairs. It must have belonged to the Wilsons, overlooked in their settling in. He picked it up, intending to set it aside until morning, when something fell from an outer pocket, a small, framed tintype photograph. Caleb bent to retrieve it, and as he straightened, the image caught the firelight. The photograph showed a man in a cavalry uniform, his posture straight and proud despite the formal stiffness of such portraits. But it was the face that caused Caleb's breath to catch in his throat, a face he knew, though he hadn't seen it in a decade. Lieutenant Robert Wilson. Memories flooded back unbidden of Fort McKenzie, of a young lieutenant who had pulled an injured scout to safety during an ambush by Blackfoot warriors. The same lieutenant who had later stood beside Caleb during the Battle of Whispering Creek, where Caleb's miscalculation had cost 5 soldiers their lives. The room seemed suddenly airless. Eleanor Wilson wasn't just any widow. She was Robert Wilson's widow. And her children, Robert's children, were now sleeping under his roof. Caleb carefully returned the photograph to the bag, his mind racing. Was this mere coincidence, or something more deliberate? Had Robert spoken of him to Eleanor before his death? Did she know of Caleb's role in that fatal battle? He moved quietly to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape now bathed in moonlight. The storm had momentarily abated, revealing a world transformed into crystal and shadow. Beautiful but treacherous, much like the past he'd tried to leave behind, now suddenly present in his home. Sleep would be long in coming tonight. Morning arrived with blinding brightness as sunlight reflected off the newly fallen snow. Caleb had risen before dawn, as was his habit, to find Samuel already at work in the kitchen, stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil. Must be 18 inches at least, the old man reported, nodding toward the window. Still coming down, too. This is just a lull. Caleb grunted acknowledgement as he poured himself coffee, his mind still troubled by the discovery of the previous night. He had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by faces of the dead and the living alike. He was spared further conversation by the arrival of Noah, already dressed and ready for the day. The boy nodded a cautious greeting. Mother says to ask if we can help with morning chores, he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. We're used to farm work. Samuel glanced at Caleb, who nodded after a moment's hesitation. Livestock needs tending, snow or no snow, he said. Horses need to be fed and watered, chickens too. Noah straightened, clearly pleased to be given responsibility. I'll get my brothers. Too young, Caleb said, surprising himself with the protective impulse. Those twins would be more hindrance than help in this weather. You can come with me. If Noah was disappointed that his brothers wouldn't join them, he didn't show it. He merely nodded and went to fetch his coat. Outside, the world had been transformed. Snow blanketed everything, smoothing the rough edges of the ranch into gentle curves and mounds. The path to the barn was nearly invisible, and Caleb led the way, breaking trail through snow that reached halfway up his calves. The barn offered welcome shelter from the biting cold. Inside, the horses nickered in greeting, their warm breath visible in the chilled air. Caleb set about his familiar routine, checking water troughs and filling feed bins, aware of Noah watching carefully before mimicking his actions. The boy worked without complaint, even tackling the messier aspects of mucking out stalls with methodical efficiency. He clearly knew his way around horses, speaking to them in low, soothing tones as he worked. You've done this before, Caleb observed as they finished the morning feeding. Noah nodded, patting the neck of a chestnut mare. We had a small farm near Kansas City, 3 horses, 2 milk cows, some chickens. It was the first personal information anyone in the Wilson family had volunteered. What happened to it? Caleb asked, keeping his tone casual as he checked the mare's foreleg where she'd had a recent strain. Noah's face closed slightly. Bank took it after father died. Mother tried to keep up with the payments, but he shrugged, the gesture too old for his young shoulders. Caleb nodded, understanding all too well how quickly fortunes could change on the frontier. Your father, he began, choosing his words carefully. He was military? A flash of pride crossed Noah's face. Cavalry, Lieutenant Robert Wilson. He served at Fort McKenzie and later at Fort Lincoln. Good man? Caleb asked, unable to help himself. The best, Noah replied without hesitation. Everyone said so. He taught me everything about horses, about being a man. His voice caught slightly, and he turned away, busying himself with a bridle that needed no adjustment. Caleb allowed the boy his privacy, moving to the back of the barn where he kept a small paddock for injured or special needs animals. Currently, it housed a wild bay stallion he'd captured 3 weeks earlier after finding it caught in a ravine with a badly gashed leg. The wound was healing well, but the horse remained wary and aggressive, pinning its ears and snorting whenever Caleb approached. That's a Mustang, Noah said, having followed at a distance. His eyes lit with interest. A real wild one. Caleb nodded. Found him injured. Too fine an animal to leave to take the die, but too ornery to appreciate the help. Noah studied the stallion with keen assessment. Father always said the wildest horses make the most loyal mounts, if you earn their trust. The words hit Caleb with unexpected force. They were exactly what Robert had told him years ago, when Caleb had complained about a particularly difficult horse he'd been assigned at Fort McKenzie. Your father knew horses, Caleb managed, turning away from the memories. Noah stepped closer to the paddock, careful to keep a respectful distance from the fence. The stallion regarded him warily, nostrils flared, but didn't retreat. He's magnificent, the boy breathed, genuine admiration in his voice. Before Caleb could respond, the barn door creaked open, revealing Eleanor Wilson wrapped in a heavy shawl, her breath clouding in the cold air. There you are, she said, relief evident in her voice as she saw Noah. Breakfast is nearly ready. She nodded a greeting to Caleb, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her hair escaping in tendrils from its pins. Despite the early hour and the challenging circumstances, she appeared remarkably composed. Mr. Sullivan, she said, her tone carefully neutral, I hope Noah has been helpful rather than a burden. He knows his way around horses, Caleb replied, noting how her gaze softened when it rested on her son. Good workers are never a burden. A small smile touched her lips. Thank you, that's kind of you to say. She turned to Noah. Come along now, your brothers are awake and asking for you. As Noah moved to join his mother, the stallion suddenly approached the fence, stretching its neck toward the boy, as if drawn by some invisible force. Noah paused, then slowly extended his hand, palm up. The horse sniffed cautiously, ears still back, but no longer pinned aggressively. Eleanor watched, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. Noah has his father's way with horses, she said softly to Caleb. Robert could gentle the wildest Mustang with just his voice and patience. It was the first time she had mentioned her husband directly to Caleb. He searched her face for any sign that she knew of his connection to Robert, but saw only a widow's wistful remembrance. Your husband, Caleb said carefully. How long has he been gone? A shadow crossed Eleanor's features. 8 months. Fever took him quickly, too quickly for... She stopped, composing herself with visible effort. We should go in. The snow is starting again. Indeed, fresh flakes had begun to fall, small and hard-driven by a rising wind. The brief respite was ending. The real storm was upon them. As they made their way back to the house, Caleb found himself studying Eleanor's profile, trying to reconcile this composed, capable woman with the memory of Lieutenant Wilson, a man he had both admired and in the end failed. Did she know? Had Robert told her about Whispering Creek, about the scout whose poor judgment had led them into an ambush? If she did know, her composed demeanor revealed nothing. And if she didn't, Caleb wasn't sure which prospect unsettled him more. The day settled into an uneasy routine as the storm intensified outside. The Wilson children, accustomed to the confinement of their recent boarding house existence, adapted remarkably well to the limitations of the ranch house. The twins engaged in a quiet game with carved wooden animals that Samuel produced from some hidden store. Emma helped Eleanor with household tasks, moving with the practiced efficiency of a girl who had grown up assuming adult responsibilities. Sophie's cough had worsened again, and she spent much of the morning curled in Eleanor's lap near the fire, listening to stories. Noah, having proven his worth during morning chores, had retreated to the window seat with a book he'd found on Caleb's modest shelf, a volume on horse breeding and training that had been gathering dust for years. Caleb himself felt strangely displaced in his own home. The natural rhythms of his day had been disrupted, his usual tasks curtailed by the storm, his space invaded by strangers who were somehow connected to his past. He spent most of the morning in his bedroom, ostensibly reviewing ranch accounts, but actually turning over the revelation of the previous night in his mind. By mid-afternoon, cabin fever had set in, despite the spaciousness of the house. The twins had grown restless, their game abandoned for increasingly boisterous exploration. Sophie's cough echoed through the rooms, harsh and concerning. Even Samuel, normally unflappable, had taken to pacing, peering out windows at the relentless snowfall. "Storm's getting worse," he announced after his fourth circuit of the main room. "Winds coming up strong from the north. Going to be a blizzard proper before nightfall." Eleanor looked up from where she sat mending one of Oliver's shirts, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "How long do these storms typically last, Mr. Eagleton?" Samuel scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Hard to say, ma'am. Could blow itself out by morning or could settle in for days. This early in the season, they are unpredictable." Concern flickered across Eleanor's face before she smoothed it away. "I see. Well, we're grateful for your shelter, however long it's needed." Sophie coughed again, the sound deeper and more troubling. Eleanor set aside her mending, moving to feel the child's forehead with the back of her hand. "She's warmer than she should be," she murmured, worry evident despite her attempt to hide it. Caleb, who had emerged from his self-imposed isolation at Samuel's weather report, found himself stepping forward. "There's willow bark in the medicine cabinet," he said. "Good for fever and coughs. My mother swore by it." Eleanor's eyes met his, surprised and grateful. "Thank you, I'd appreciate that." As Caleb went to retrieve the remedy, he heard Oliver's excited voice from the front window. "Someone's coming! There's a horse!" Samuel moved quickly to the window, squinting through the swirling snow. "He's right. Rider coming up the main road." Caleb joined him, peering out at the nearly obscured landscape. Sure enough, a dark shape moved through the whiteness, a horse and rider struggling against the driving snow. "Fool to be out in this," Samuel muttered. "Must be desperate or lost." "Or both," Caleb replied, already reaching for his heavy coat. "Better bring them in before they freeze." Eleanor appeared at his side, the willow bark forgotten. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Keep the children inside," Caleb said, buckling on his gun belt out of habit. "Make up a hot drink for whoever it is. They'll be half frozen." He stepped out into the storm, the wind immediately tearing at his clothing and driving snow into his face with stinging force. Visibility was poor, but he could make out the rider now only 50 yards from the house, hunched low over the horse's neck. As Caleb approached, the rider looked up, revealing a face he hadn't seen in years, but recognized instantly. Gabriel Hayes, once a sergeant in Caleb's unit at Fort McKenzie, now wearing the badge of a federal marshal pinned to his heavy coat. "Sullivan!" Gabriel called over the howl of the wind, relief evident in his voice. "Thought I might have missed the turn in this devil's brew." Caleb led the way to the barn, where they could speak without shouting above the storm. Once inside, Gabriel dismounted stiffly, his movements betraying the cold that had settled into his bones during his journey. "You're a long way from anywhere, Hayes," Caleb said, helping to unsaddle the exhausted horse. "Must be important to ride in this weather." Gabriel nodded, rubbing his gloved hands together to restore circulation. "Official business, I'm afraid. Tracking a gang that robbed the hell in a bank 5 days ago. Trail led this way before the snow covered it." Caleb felt a prickle of unease. "Bank robbers? Out here?" "4 men and a woman," Gabriel confirmed, his weathered face grim beneath his ice-crusted beard. "Took over $2,000. Shot a teller who tried to raise the alarm." He paused, studying Caleb's face. "The woman is what brings me specifically to your door." "How so?" Gabriel reached inside his coat, producing a folded paper that he handed to Caleb. "She gave her name as Eleanor Wilson, described herself as a widow with children to garner sympathy. Witnesses said she had a way with words, refined, educated, used the children as cover to scout the bank the day before." Caleb unfolded the paper with fingers that suddenly felt numb, and not from cold. It was a wanted poster, with a crude drawing of a woman who, with the right imagination, might resemble Eleanor. This description, Caleb said carefully, it could match a lot of women. Gabriel nodded. True enough, but our information says she was heading this way. Word in town was you were expecting a woman to arrive, a mail-order bride. Thought I'd check if she'd shown up, see if she matches our suspect. Caleb's mind raced. The Eleanor Wilson under his roof certainly didn't seem like a bank robber. She was refined, yes, and certainly capable. But a criminal? The mother who tenderly cared for her sick child, who mended clothes with such careful stitches, who had traveled so far on the slim chance of finding security for her family? And yet, she had arrived unexpectedly. Her story about meeting Rebecca Mitchell could be a convenient fabrication. She had been vague about her circumstances, deflecting personal questions. Sullivan? Gabriel prompted, breaking into his thoughts. Has your bride arrived? Caleb made his decision in an instant. No, he said firmly. The stage brought no one yesterday. Driver said the lady changed her mind in Denver. Gabriel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't challenge the statement. That's so? Shame after all the preparation. He glanced around the barn. Mind if I warm up a bit before heading back out? Left my men camped down by Miller's Creek. Should rejoin them before dark. Storm's getting worse, Caleb said, gesturing toward the barn door where snow was already drifting under the gap. You won't make it back to Miller's Creek today. Better stay here for the night. Gabriel hesitated, clearly torn between duty and practicality. Wouldn't want to impose. Not an imposition, Caleb replied, already leading the tired horse to an empty stall. Samuel will be glad for fresh company and new stories. The lie about Eleanor felt strange on his tongue, but Caleb couldn't bring himself to retract it. Not until he knew more. Not until he was certain. They trudged back to the house through snow that had deepened noticeably in the short time they'd been in the barn. Inside, Samuel had stoked the fire to a roaring blaze, and the aroma of coffee filled the warm air. Eleanor looked up from where she sat with Sophie, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the newcomer. The children, too, regarded Gabriel with open curiosity. Marshal Gabriel Hayes, Caleb announced, keeping his tone casual, caught in the storm on official business. He'll be staying the night. If Eleanor recognized the name or was troubled by the man's profession, she gave no sign. Welcome, Marshal, she said with a polite nod. Please warm yourself by the fire. There's coffee and stew left from midday. Gabriel removed his hat, revealing hair more gray than the brown Caleb remembered, and nodded his thanks. Much obliged, ma'am. Caleb made the necessary introductions, presenting Eleanor and her children as the Wilson family. Dumb family, stranded by the stage yesterday on their way to Helena. If Gabriel found this coincidence remarkable given his mission, his face revealed nothing. Noah watched the marshal with undisguised interest, particularly the badge that gleamed against his dark coat. The twins were less impressed by the man than by the large revolver he unbuckled and carefully set aside before taking a seat by the fire. As Samuel engaged Gabriel in conversation about conditions in town and news from the wider world, Caleb caught Eleanor's eye and tilted his head slightly toward the kitchen. She nodded almost imperceptibly, rising to her feet after settling Sophie among her siblings. I should check on the stew, she said lightly, moving toward the kitchen. Caleb followed a moment later, the sounds of Samuel's animated questions covering his departure. In the relative privacy of the kitchen, Eleanor turned to him, her face composed but her eyes wary. Is something wrong, Mr. Sullivan? Caleb studied her, searching for any sign of deception or fear. Marshal Hayes is hunting bank robbers, he said bluntly. A woman using the name Eleanor Wilson was among them. The color drained from Eleanor's face, and she gripped the edge of the work table for support. What? The Helena Bank was robbed 5 days ago. Over $2,000 taken, a man shot. Caleb kept his voice low but direct. The woman involved called herself Eleanor Wilson, described herself as a widow with children. Eleanor's gray eyes widened in shock, then darkened with understanding. And you believe I could be this person? I don't know what to believe, Caleb admitted. You arrived unexpectedly at my ranch with a story I can't verify, just as a criminal with your exact name is being hunted in this area. Eleanor's back straightened, dignity overcoming her initial shock. Mr. Sullivan, I have never been to Helena. I have never robbed anything in my life, nor would I ever place my children in such danger. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. I understand your suspicion, but I am not a criminal. I am exactly who I claim to be, a widow seeking a better life for her family. Something in her unwavering gaze, in the quiet conviction of her words, struck Caleb as fundamentally true. Yet doubt lingered. He had been wrong about people before, with devastating consequences. Hayes will want to question you, he said. I told him you were traveling to Helena, not from it. I didn't mention Wilson as your name. Surprise flickered across Eleanor's face. You lied to protect me. Why? Caleb looked away, uncomfortable with the question. I don't like making judgments without facts, he said gruffly. And your children don't deserve to be caught in this mess if it's just a coincidence of names. Eleanor studied him, something softening in her expression. Thank you, that is uncommonly kind. Caleb shifted, unused to gratitude. Hayes will stay the night. Keep your story simple, consistent. If you are who you say you are, you have nothing to fear. And if he doesn't believe me, Eleanor asked, voicing the question Caleb had been avoiding. Then we'll deal with that when it comes, he replied, meeting her eyes directly. I don't abandon people under my roof, Mrs. Wilson. The statement surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. But as he spoke the words, he realized they were true. Whatever her past, whatever connection she might have to Robert Wilson and his own tangled history, Caleb would not see her and her children thrown to the wolves or to the storm without cause. A small, trembling smile touched Eleanor's lips. I believe you, Mr. Sullivan, and I promise you'll not regret this trust. Before Caleb could respond, Sophie's harsh cough echoed from the main room, followed by the child's frightened cry for her mother. Eleanor moved immediately, maternal instinct overriding all other concerns. Caleb remained in the kitchen a moment longer, trying to make sense of the tumult of emotions her simple words had stirred in him. Trust was not something he gave easily, not anymore, not since Whispering Creek. Yet something in Eleanor Wilson's steady gaze and the quiet dignity with which she faced adversity had sparked a forgotten feeling in him, a willingness to believe, to hope that not all connections led to betrayal or loss. As he returned to the main room where Gabriel was regaling the twins with an edited tale of frontier justice, Caleb caught Samuel watching him with knowing eyes. The old man nodded slightly, as if confirming some private thought. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, driving snow against the windows in white sheets. They were all trapped here together, the hunter, the possibly hunted, and Caleb caught between them with a debt to the past he had never expected to pay. Dinner was a strained affair despite Samuel's efforts to maintain conversation. Gabriel, while not openly suspicious, studied Eleanor with the careful attention of a lawman accustomed to separating truth from falsehood. Eleanor, for her part, maintained her composure admirably, answering questions about their journey and plans with just enough detail to be plausible without elaboration that might lead to contradictions. The children, sensing the undercurrents, were quieter than they had been at previous meals. Even the twins kept their usual chatter to a minimum, casting occasional worried glances at their mother. Noah barely touched his food, his attention fixed on Gabriel with an intensity that suggested he understood more of the situation than Caleb might have expected. Only Sophie seemed oblivious to the tension, her illness making her fretful and demanding of her mother's attention. Her cough had worsened as the evening progressed, and her small face was flushed with fever despite the willow bark tea Eleanor had coaxed her to drink. Your little one sounds poorly, Gabriel observed as Sophie suffered through another coughing fit. My sister's boy had a cough like that last winter, turned to lung fever before they got it under control. Eleanor's face tightened with worry as she rubbed Sophie's back. I'm hoping it won't come to that. She's always been strong, despite her size. My mother used to make a poultice of mustard and pine tar for chest complaints, Gabriel offered unexpectedly. Smelled terrible, but worked wonders. We have both in the pantry, Samuel said, rising from the table. I'll mix them up. The conversation turned to remedies for winter ailments, the tension momentarily eased by this common ground of concern for a sick child. Caleb found himself watching Eleanor's hands as she soothed Sophie. Strong, capable hands with the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. but gentle in their touch. Not the hands of a woman who would shoot a bank teller, he thought. But then he had been wrong about people before. As the evening wore on, Sophie finally fell into a restless sleep in her mother's arms, the mustard poultice seeming to ease her breathing somewhat. Eleanor carried her to bed, followed by Emma, who would help ready the younger children for sleep. With the children gone, Gabriel turned to more direct conversation. "Quite a coincidence," he remarked, accepting the whiskey Samuel offered. "You waiting for a bride who doesn't show, and then a stranded family turns up instead." Caleb nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Frontiers full of coincidences. People's plans change, stages run late, weather intervenes. Gabriel sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. True enough, still makes a man wonder. Before Caleb could formulate a response that wouldn't raise further suspicion, Noah reappeared in the doorway, his young face set in determined lines. "Mr. Sullivan," he said formally, "may I check on the horses before turning in? I'm concerned about that stallion in this cold." Caleb recognized the request for what it was, an attempt to speak with him privately. "Good thinking," he replied, rising from his chair. "I'll come with you." Gabriel raised an eyebrow but made no comment as Caleb and Noah donned their coats and headed out into the storm. The trek to the barn was arduous, the snow now knee-deep and still falling heavily. Inside, the horses were restless, disturbed by the howling wind that found its way through every crack in the sturdy structure. Once the door was securely closed behind them, Noah turned to Caleb, all pretense of checking the horses abandoned. "That marshal is looking for my mother, isn't he?" he demanded, his voice cracking with the strain of appearing older than his years. "I heard parts of what you told her in the kitchen. Someone used her name in a robbery." Caleb studied the boy, impressed despite himself with Noah's perception and courage. "Yes," he admitted, seeing no point in falsehoods. "But I don't believe your mother is involved." Noah's shoulders slumped slightly in relief. "She's not. She couldn't be. But that won't stop him from taking her away, will it? Lawmen don't always care about the truth." There was a bitterness in the boy's voice that spoke of experience beyond his years, perhaps of watching his mother struggle after his father's death, of witnessing the indifference or cruelty of those with power over their lives. "Hayes is a good man," Caleb said, more confident in this assessment than he might have expected. "He wants justice, not just an arrest." Noah looked unconvinced. "Will you help us if he decides to take her?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Caleb had already lied to a federal marshal, a small lie perhaps, but a deliberate obstruction of justice nonetheless. Was he prepared to do more, to actively intervene if Gabriel decided Eleanor was his suspect? "Your mother is under my roof," Caleb said finally, choosing his words with care. "That means something out here. I won't let harm come to her or to any of you without cause." Noah studied him as if searching for the truth behind the words. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, for he nodded once, decisively. "My father would have done the same," he said quietly. "He always said a man's worth is measured by how he treats those in need." The mention of Robert Wilson sent a pang through Caleb's chest. Your father was right. They checked the horses in silence after that, each lost in private thoughts. The stallion remained aloof in his stall, but seemed less agitated than earlier, watching Noah with wary interest as the boy refilled his water trough. As they prepared to brave the storm again for the return to the house, Noah paused, his hand on the barn door. "Mr. Sullivan," he began hesitantly, "did you ever serve at Fort McKenzie, with the cavalry?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "I did," he admitted, "as a scout, not a soldier. Why do you ask?" Noah's expression was unreadable in the lantern light. "Just wondering. Father spoke of his time there sometimes." He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. "We should get back before they wonder where we are." The return journey was made in silence, both of them bent against the driving snow. Inside, they found the main room empty except for Samuel, who was banking the fire for the night. "Marshall's turned in," the old man reported. "Mrs. Wilson, too, after checking on the little one again." He eyed them curiously. "Everything all right in the barn?" "Fine," Caleb replied shortly, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. "Animals are settled." Noah excused himself to bed, leaving Caleb alone with Samuel. The old man waited until the boy's footsteps had faded down the hallway before speaking. That's a sharp lad, he observed, poking at the fire. Sees more than he lets on. Caleb nodded, sinking into his chair with a sigh. Too sharp for his own good, maybe. Samuel straightened, wincing slightly at the stiffness in his back. You think the mother might be mixed up in this bank business? Really? No, Caleb said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I don't. Samuel studied him thoughtfully. Known her less than 2 days. I know, Caleb acknowledged. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't have to make sense, Samuel replied with unexpected gentleness. Some things we just know, deep down where it counts. He moved toward his own small room off the kitchen. Get some sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles without borrowing from tonight. Left alone, Caleb stared into the dying fire, his thoughts a tumult of past and present. He had been so certain all those years ago at Whispering Creek, so confident in his assessment of the terrain and the enemy's movements. That certainty had cost 5 men their lives and haunted his dreams ever since. Now he felt a different kind of certainty about Eleanor Wilson, a belief in her innocence that defied logical explanation. Was he making the same mistake, trusting his judgment when evidence suggested caution? Or was this his chance to finally get something right? The fire crackled softly, offering no answers as it burned down to embers. Outside, the storm continued unabated, blanketing the world in white silence, broken only by the moaning of the wind. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, the real Eleanor Wilson impersonator might be hiding, unaware that her actions had cast suspicion on an innocent family. Or perhaps the answer was simpler and more disturbing. Perhaps the woman sleeping down the hall was not who she claimed to be at all. Caleb rose finally, bone-weary but knowing sleep would be elusive. As he moved toward his bedroom, he passed the door to the room where Eleanor and her daughter slept. It stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see Eleanor sitting beside Sophie's bed, one hand resting on the child's forehead, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. The sight stirred something long dormant in his chest, a protectiveness he had not felt since the days when he had ridden with men he called brothers, before Whispering Creek changed everything, before he had retreated to this isolated ranch, determined to need no one and to be needed by no one in return. He continued to his room silently, unwilling to disturb the private moment. But as he lay in his bed listening to the storm, he knew with growing certainty that whatever the coming day might bring, he would not stand aside if Gabriel moved against Eleanor. The debt he owed to Robert Wilson's memory, and perhaps to his own conscience, would not allow it. The realization should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, it brought a strange peace, and he drifted finally into dreamless sleep as the storm raged on. Caleb woke in darkness to the sound of Sophie's harsh coughing, followed by Eleanor's soothing murmurs. The storm still howled outside, rattling the window panes with gusts that seemed even stronger than before. He rose, knowing further sleep was unlikely, and dressed in the cold room. The main room was dimly lit by the banked fire, now little more than glowing coals. Caleb added wood carefully, coaxing the flames back to life before lighting a lamp. The mantel clock showed just past 3, hours yet until dawn. Soft footsteps in the hallway made him turn. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in a shawl over her nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders. In the lamplight, her face showed the strain of interrupted sleep and ongoing worry. I'm sorry if Sophie woke you, she said quietly, moving closer to the rekindled fire. Her fever's worse, and the cough. She trailed off, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Sit, Caleb offered, gesturing to the chair closest to the fire. I'll make tea. Eleanor sank gratefully into the chair, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The firelight cast a warm glow on her face, softening the worry lines that had formed around her eyes and mouth. With her hair down, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and startlingly beautiful in a way Caleb hadn't allowed himself to notice before. He busied himself with the kettle, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. When he returned with 2 steaming cups, Eleanor had closed her eyes, her head resting against the chair back. For a moment, he thought she had fallen asleep, but she stirred at his approach, accepting the tea with a grateful smile. You're kind, she murmured, warming her hands on the cup, despite your best efforts to appear otherwise. Caleb settled into the chair opposite her, uncertain how to respond to the gentle teasing in her voice. Practical, he corrected. Hard to sleep with all that coughing. Eleanor's smile widened slightly, as if she saw through his gruffness. Of course, purely practical. She sipped her tea, then looked at him over the rim of her cup. Like lying to a federal marshal about my name and destination. Very practical, indeed. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Hayes jumps to conclusions sometimes. Better to let him cool off in this storm before presenting him with complications. Complications, Eleanor repeated softly. Is that what my family and I are to you, Mr. Sullivan? Complications? There was no accusation in her tone, only genuine curiosity and perhaps a hint of something more vulnerable. Caleb found himself answering with unexpected honesty. I don't know what you are, he admitted. Not what I expected, certainly. Nor you what I expected, Eleanor replied, her gray eyes studying him with quiet intensity. When I met Rebecca Mitchell in Denver, when she suggested I take her place, I imagined someone different, harsher perhaps, more frontier. Caleb raised an eyebrow, unsure if he should be offended. Disappointed? No, Eleanor said quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks that owed nothing to the fire. Not at all, just surprised. You're not what your advertisement suggested. Neither are you and 5 children what I advertised for, Caleb pointed out, though without heat. Eleanor's face grew serious. No, and I understand if you feel misled. I wouldn't blame you for sending us on our way once the weather clears. She looked down at her tea. I took a chance, Mr. Sullivan. A desperate one, perhaps. But when Miss Mitchell showed me your letter, when she spoke of this place, she gestured vaguely, encompassing the house and the land beyond. It sounded like somewhere my children could be safe, could thrive. Caleb watched the emotions play across her expressive face, hope, fear, determination, and beneath it all, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long alone. What happened? He asked quietly. After your husband died? Eleanor was silent for a long moment, and Caleb thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. Everything fell apart so quickly. The farm was mortgaged, of course. What property isn't these days? Robert had been making payments regularly, but after he was gone, she shook her head. I tried. I kept the livestock fed, the crops tended. Noah worked himself to exhaustion helping me, but the bank wouldn't extend the loan for a widow with 5 children. They foreclosed 3 months after the funeral. She took another sip of tea, her hands steady despite the painful memories. We moved to Kansas City, where I had a distant cousin who offered us rooms above her millinery shop. I sewed, took in laundry, did whatever work I could find. But city life is expensive and 5 growing children. She smiled ruefully. Well, they do insist on eating regularly. So you decided to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, Caleb said, filling in the gap, despite having 5 children who weren't mentioned in the arrangement. No, Eleanor corrected gently. I was actually on my way to Oregon, to another cousin who had written that she could find me work in a boarding house. It was on that journey that I met Rebecca Mitchell at the Denver station. She set her empty teacup aside, her gaze distant as she recalled the meeting. She was nervous about coming here, about marrying a stranger. When she learned I was traveling with children, she seemed almost envious. She asked about them, about my life. We talked for hours while waiting for our respective connections. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips at the memory. And then James Harrington walked into the station, a timber merchant headed to Oregon on the same train I was to take. The way he looked at Rebecca, the way she looked at him, it was like watching 2 people recognize each other from a dream. Eleanor's gaze returned to Caleb, her expression earnest. By the time my train was called, she had decided to continue to Oregon with Mr. Harrington. She pressed your advertisement into my hand and said perhaps fate had brought us all to that station for a reason, that perhaps I was meant to come here instead. She shook her head, a hint of self-deprecation in her smile. It sounds foolish now, saying it aloud. A decision made on the word of a stranger, based on nothing but desperation and perhaps a touch of romantic fancy that I thought I'd left behind with my youth. Not foolish, Caleb said quietly. Brave. Reckless, maybe, but brave. Eleanor looked surprised, then touched by his assessment. Thank you. Not many would see it that way. They fell silent, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. In the dim, warm light, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her guard lowered by exhaustion and the intimacy of the hour, Eleanor seemed both stronger and more vulnerable than Caleb had yet seen her. A woman of contradictions, refined yet practical, gentle yet resilient, carrying her burdens with a grace that humbled him. "Your husband," Caleb said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "He was stationed at Fort Mackenzie when I was a scout there." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "You knew Robert?" Caleb nodded, choosing his words carefully. "We served together, briefly. He was a good officer, respected by his men." "Yes, he was," Eleanor agreed, her expression softening with memory. "He spoke often of his time at Fort Mackenzie. Said the men he served with there were among the finest he'd known." She studied Caleb with new interest. "He never mentioned you specifically, I don't think. But then he knew so many during his career." Caleb felt a mixture of relief and disappointment at her words. Relief that she didn't associate him with the tragedy at Whispering Creek. Disappointment that Robert had not deemed him memorable enough to mention to his wife. "It was a long time ago," he said dismissively. "People change." Eleanor's perceptive gaze lingered on his face. "They do. Not always for the better, but sometimes. Sometimes adversity shapes us into something stronger than we were before." She stood, gathering her shawl more securely around her shoulders. "I should check on Sophie again. Thank you for the tea and for the conversation." As she turned to go, a violent gust of wind rattled the house, causing the windows to creak in protest. Eleanor paused, looking toward the sound with concern. "Storm's getting worse," Caleb observed, rising to his feet. "But this house has weathered worse. You're safe here." Eleanor met his eyes and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. "I believe you," she said simply, and then she was gone, disappearing down the hallway to tend to her sick child. Caleb remained by the fire, turning their conversation over in his mind. Eleanor Wilson had traveled hundreds of miles on the strength of a stranger's suggestion and a newspaper advertisement. She had faced the loss of her husband, her home, and nearly her dignity, yet maintained a grace and strength that many men he'd known would envy. And now she faced a new threat, one wearing a federal marshal's badge and carrying a warrant for a woman who shared her name. Caleb added another log to the fire, watching as the flames leaped up to embrace it. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but inside, something had shifted. A decision had been made, though he hadn't consciously formulated it until this moment. Eleanor Wilson and her children were under his protection now. Whatever Gabriel Hayes might say or do when morning came, Caleb would not abandon them to face this threat alone. The debt he owed to Robert Wilson would be paid, one way or another. Dawn arrived with no discernible lightening of the sky, only a gradual awareness that night had surrendered its dominion. The storm continued unabated, if anything growing stronger with the new day. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that obscured the lower panes, and the wind's howl had taken on a banshee-like quality that set nerves on edge. Caleb found Gabriel already awake in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out at what little could be seen of the transformed landscape. "Never seen a storm hit this early with such force," the marshal observed without turning. "Must be 3 feet out there already, with more coming." Caleb poured his own coffee, noting that Gabriel had already stoked the fire and set the pot to boil. Some habits of military life never faded, no matter how many years passed. "Roads will be impassable for days," he agreed. "Maybe a week." Gabriel turned then, studying Caleb with the shrewd assessment that had made him an effective lawman. "Meaning I'm stuck here, along with your unexpected guests." "Looks that way." The marshal sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Convenient timing for someone with something to hide." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "Or inconvenient for travelers with legitimate business." A faint smile touched Gabriel's weathered face. "You've changed, Sullivan. Time was you'd be the first to suspect the worst of strangers." "Maybe I've learned that snap judgments cost too much," Caleb replied, the words carrying more weight than Gabriel could know. The marshal nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Still, I'd like to ask Mrs. Wilson a few questions when she's up. Just to satisfy my curiosity, you understand." Before Caleb could respond, Noah appeared in the doorway, already dressed despite the early hour. The boy's eyes moved between the two men, alert for tensions that might affect his family's safety. "Mother's still with Sophie," he said, addressing Caleb rather than Gabriel. "The fever broke around dawn, but the cough's no better. She asked if there might be more of that willow bark tea." Caleb nodded. "In the cabinet above the stove. I'll prepare it." Noah hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave the two men alone with his family's fate possibly hanging in the balance. Gabriel seemed to sense the boy's concern. "Your sister's been ill long?" the marshal asked, his tone conversational. "Just since Denver," Noah replied cautiously. "The mountain air, mother thinks." Gabriel nodded sympathetically. "My sister's youngest gets chest complaints every winter. Worrisome, especially when you're traveling." The simple acknowledgement of shared concern seemed to ease Noah's wariness slightly. He approached the stove, watching as Caleb prepared the medicinal tea. "The twins are awake," the boy reported. "Hungry, as usual. Is it all right if I start breakfast? Mother taught me the basics." "I'll help," Samuel announced, appearing in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing. The old ranch hand nodded a greeting to Gabriel. "Marshal, sleep well?" "Well enough, considering," Gabriel replied, "though I'm worried about my men camped by the creek. This weather's no joke." Samuel's roomy eyes narrowed with concern. "Miller's Creek can flood with rapid melt. They'd be wise to move to higher ground if they haven't already." Gabriel nodded, his own concern evident. "Would if they could. Doubt they can navigate in this." "How many men?" Caleb asked, already thinking of the logistics involved. "Just two, Deputies Chapman and Mercer." Gabriel stared back out at the swirling snow. "Good men, but young. Not sure they've weathered a Montana blizzard before." The implied request hung in the air. Despite the complications it would create, Caleb couldn't ignore the potential danger to the deputies. "We'll try to reach them after breakfast," he said, "if the snow lets up enough to see 20 yards ahead." Relief flickered across Gabriel's face. "Appreciate it." Samuel and Noah moved about the kitchen with surprising coordination, preparing a simple but hearty breakfast as Caleb finished the medicinal tea. By the time Eleanor appeared with Sophie in her arms, the smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits filled the warm air. The little girl looked pale and drawn, her usual energy sapped by illness, but her fever had clearly broken. She rested her head on her mother's shoulder, watching the activity with dull interest. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice revealing the strain of a night spent tending a sick child. Despite this, she was fully dressed, her hair neatly pinned, her appearance as composed as circumstances allowed. Only the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "Mrs. Wilson," Gabriel acknowledged with a polite nod, "I hear your daughter's had a rough night." "She's improving," Eleanor replied, accepting the cup of willow bark tea from Caleb with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Your remedy has been most helpful." Caleb nodded, acutely aware of Gabriel watching their interaction with careful attention. "Samuel and Noah have breakfast well in hand," he said. "Why don't you sit with Sophie by the fire? We can bring your plates when it's ready." Eleanor's grateful smile deepened. "That would be wonderful." As she moved toward the main room, Gabriel caught Caleb's eye, one eyebrow raised in subtle inquiry. Caleb ignored the unspoken question, turning instead to help with the breakfast preparations. The meal was a strangely communal affair, with everyone gathered around the large oak table, despite the tensions simmering beneath the surface. The twins, Oliver and Ethan, were oblivious to the undercurrents, chattering about the enormous snowdrifts visible through the windows, and speculating about whether they could tunnel through them. Emma helped Sophie with her food, her young face showing mature concern for her sister's well-being. Noah remained watchful, his attention divided between Gabriel and Caleb, alert for any sign of threat to his family. "Mrs. Wilson," Gabriel said casually as the meal was winding down, "I understand you're bound for Helena. Family there?" Eleanor set down her fork, meeting his gaze directly. "A teaching position," she replied smoothly, "at the new school opening this winter. The children will have educational opportunities that weren't available to us in Kansas City." Gabriel nodded, his expression revealing nothing. "Interesting coincidence. I've just come from Helena myself." "Is that so?" Eleanor's composure remained intact, though Caleb noticed her hand tighten slightly on her napkin. "I hope the city is as pleasant as I've been led to believe." "Has its charms," Gabriel agreed. "Had some excitement recently, though. Bank robbery 5 days ago. Made quite a stir in town." The twins' eyes widened with interest at this dramatic turn in the conversation. Was there a gunfight? Ethan asked eagerly. Did you catch the bad guys? Gabriel smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. No gunfight, thankfully, and we're still looking for the culprits. A matter of time, though. Justice has a long reach on the frontier. His eyes returned to Eleanor as he spoke the last words, and Caleb saw a subtle challenge there. Eleanor, however, showed no reaction beyond polite interest. I'm sure the citizens of Helena appreciate your diligence, Marshal, she said, then turned her attention to Sophie, who had begun coughing again. Excuse us, please. Sophie needs to rest. As Eleanor helped the little girl from the table, Gabriel watched thoughtfully, then turned to Caleb. If the snow's let up at all, we should check on my deputies. Caleb nodded, rising from the table. Samuel, Noah, can you manage things here? The old ranch hand waved him off. Been managing this place longer than you've owned it, boss. We'll be fine. Noah looked like he wanted to volunteer to join the rescue party, but a quick glance at his mother's retreating form seemed to remind him of his responsibilities. We'll take care of everything, he assured Caleb, his young voice earnest. Preparing for the trek to Miller's Creek was no small undertaking. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and the wind chill would make exposure deadly after even a short time. Caleb and Gabriel layered clothing, wrapped scarves around their faces, and donned heavy gloves before venturing out into the storm. The world outside the ranch house had been transformed beyond recognition. Snow drifted against the buildings in smooth, sculptural forms that reached nearly to the eaves in places. The path to the barn had vanished entirely, and they waded through snow that reached mid-thigh, each step requiring significant effort. Inside the barn, the animals were restless, disturbed by the howling wind that found its way through every crack in the wooden structure. The horses snorted and shifted nervously in their stalls, except for the wild stallion, which watched their activities with wary intensity. That's a fine animal, Gabriel observed as they saddled two of the steadier horses for their journey. Mountain bred? Caleb nodded. Found him caught in a ravine with a gashed leg, too fine to leave to die. Gabriel studied the stallion with professional appreciation. He's taking to captivity better than I'd expect. Usually they fight the stall more. Noah Wilson has a way with him, Caleb said without thinking. Boy has his father's touch with horses. Gabriel's hands paused in adjusting his saddle. You knew Wilson, the husband? Caleb cursed his careless tongue. Briefly, he admitted, at Fort Mackenzie, years back. A new alertness entered Gabriel's gaze. Interesting. Another coincidence. Caleb returned to saddling his horse, unwilling to be drawn further on the subject. Miller's Creek is about 2 miles southeast. In this weather, it'll take us an hour at least. Gabriel accepted the change of subject with a nod, though Caleb knew the marshal would not forget this new information. Let's hope they had sense enough to secure shelter. Creek bed's no place to be in weather like this. They led the horses outside, mounted with some difficulty in the deep snow, and set off. The going was painfully slow, the horses struggling to navigate terrain rendered unrecognizable by the storm. The wind drove snow into their faces with stinging force. Visibility reduced to mere yards even when the gusts momentarily abated. They rode in silence for most of the journey, saving their breath and energy for the difficult trek. Only when they approached the vicinity of Miller's Creek did Gabriel speak again. Sullivan, he called over the wind, I've known you 15 years, served with you, fought alongside you. I'd like to think that counts for something. Caleb glanced at him, the lower half of his face obscured by his scarf, only his eyes visible between hat and wrapping. It does. Then level with me. That woman back there, she's not just some random traveler, is she? The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised Caleb, yet it did. He weighed his options carefully before responding. She's Robert Wilson's widow, he said finally, opting for a partial truth. Beyond that, I know as little as you do. Gabriel studied him through narrowed eyes. And you didn't mention this connection because it's not relevant, Caleb replied, perhaps more sharply than he intended. Wilson's been dead 8 months. Whatever history he and I shared has no bearing on his widow's current situation. Maybe, Gabriel conceded, though his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. Just strikes me as odd that she'd end up on your doorstep of all places. Before Caleb could respond, a shout carried faintly through the storm, a human voice calling for help. Both men immediately turned their horses toward the sound, pushing the animals to greater effort despite the treacherous conditions. They found the deputies' camp in disarray. The small tent they had erected was half collapsed under the weight of snow, and one of the men, Mercer, a lanky youth barely out of his teens, was frantically digging in a snowdrift while calling his companion's name. "Marshall!" he cried with relief upon seeing Gabriel. "Thank God! It's Chapman." The creek rose in the night and then froze again. He went to move the horses to higher ground and fell through the ice. I pulled him out. "But he's freezing, sir. Can't seem to warm him." Gabriel dismounted quickly, Caleb following suit. They found Deputy Chapman huddled in what remained of the tent, wrapped in every available blanket but still shivering violently, his lips blue with cold. "Hypothermia," Caleb diagnosed grimly. "We need to get him back to the ranch immediately." With efficient teamwork born of their military days, Caleb and Gabriel secured Chapman to Caleb's horse, with Caleb mounting behind to keep the semi-conscious deputy upright. Mercer would ride with Gabriel. The return journey would be even slower and more difficult with the additional burdens, but they had no choice. Chapman would not survive much longer in these conditions. The trek back to Pinewood seemed interminable. Each yard gained a small victory against the elements. Chapman's condition deteriorated steadily, his shivering giving way to a more dangerous limpness that had Caleb constantly checking to ensure the young man still breathed. By the time the ranch buildings came into view through the swirling snow, Caleb's own extremities had gone numb despite his heavy gloves and boots. Gabriel and Mercer fared little better. Their faces raw from exposure were not protected by scarves. Samuel must have been watching for their return, for he threw open the barn doors as they approached, his aged face tight with concern. Noah appeared beside him, his eyes widening at the sight of the nearly unconscious deputy. "Get blankets, hot water bottles," Caleb ordered as they dismounted carefully, supporting Chapman between them. "And tell Mrs. Wilson we'll need the bed in the study. It's closest to the fire." Noah ran to the house immediately, while Samuel helped stabilize Chapman as they half-carried, half-dragged the young man through the snow. Inside, Eleanor was already in motion, directing the twins to fetch more firewood, while Emma helped clear the study for the new patient. "Hypothermia," Caleb explained tersely as they maneuvered Chapman onto the bed. "Fell through ice." Eleanor nodded, her earlier wariness of Gabriel set aside in the face of this more immediate crisis. "We need to get him out of those wet clothes," she said decisively. "Emma, bring those blankets we warmed by the fire. Noah, help your brothers with the wood. We need to get this room as hot as possible." Gabriel watched with some surprise as his deputy's care was efficiently taken over by the Wilson family, each member instinctively finding their role in the emergency. Eleanor's competence in crisis was impressive, her movements sure and her instructions clear as she directed the effort to save the young man's life. "Warm bricks at his feet and under his arms," she instructed as Mercer hovered anxiously nearby. "Not too hot. We need to raise his temperature gradually." Caleb found himself working alongside her with unexpected harmony, anticipating her needs and supporting her efforts without the need for explicit direction. When their hands briefly touched as they adjusted the blankets around Chapman, he felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the crisis at hand. Within an hour, Chapman's color had improved slightly, though he remained dangerously chilled. The study had been transformed into a sick room, with Samuel and Mercer taking the first watch while the others retreated to the kitchen to warm themselves with hot coffee. "You've done this before," Gabriel observed to Eleanor, his tone somewhere between statement and question. She accepted a cup of coffee from Emma with a tired smile. "Frontier life doesn't leave much room for inexperience with emergencies, Marshal. My husband's unit once rescued a family caught in an early blizzard near Fort McKenzie. They stayed with us at the fort for nearly a week while recovering. I learned a great deal from the post surgeon." Gabriel nodded, studying her with new consideration. "Lucky for my deputy." "I only hope Sophie doesn't catch a new chill with all the doors opening and closing," Eleanor replied, glancing toward the main room where the little girl was curled up on the sofa watching the activities with drowsy interest. "Your daughter seems improved," Gabriel noted. "Yes, thank God." Eleanor's relief was genuine, her smile softening the exhaustion in her face. "Children are remarkably resilient, more so than adults, I sometimes think." Gabriel sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Wilson, I hope you won't think me indelicate, but I'm curious about your late husband. Sullivan mentioned he knew Lieutenant Wilson at Fort McKenzie." Eleanor's gaze flickered briefly to Caleb before returning to Gabriel. Yes, Robert served there for 2 years before being transferred to Fort Lincoln. It was early in our marriage. Distinguished officer by all accounts, Gabriel continued casually, decorated for bravery during the Battle of Whispering Creek, as I recall. The name sent a jolt through Caleb, a physical reaction he couldn't entirely suppress. Eleanor seemed to notice, her perceptive gaze moving between the two men, with growing awareness that the conversation carried undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Yes, she said cautiously. Though Robert rarely spoke of that day, he said some victories come at too high a price to celebrate. Gabriel nodded, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. Wise perspective. The lieutenant was known for his good judgment. Caleb set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. Chapman will need regular monitoring through the night. We should establish a rotation. The abrupt change of subject was not subtle, but Gabriel allowed it, turning his attention to the practical matter at hand. Mercer and I can split the night. No sense in everyone losing sleep. I'll take a shift, Caleb insisted. You've both had a rough journey. And I, Eleanor added quietly, I'm accustomed to night watches after Sophie's illness. Gabriel studied them both, something unreadable in his expression. Very well, a 2-hour rotation should work. Mercer first, then me, then Sullivan, with Mrs. Wilson taking the pre-dawn hours when the fever might spike. With the schedule established, they dispersed to their various tasks. Gabriel to relieve Mercer for a rest, Eleanor to check on her children, and Samuel to see to the evening meal preparations. Caleb found himself alone in the kitchen, the mention of Whispering Creek having unleashed memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when Noah appeared in the doorway, his young face troubled. Mr. Sullivan, may I speak with you privately? Caleb nodded, gesturing for the boy to enter. Noah closed the door behind him, his movements betraying his nervousness. The marshal keeps asking about my father, he said without preamble. About Fort McKenzie and battles I've never heard of. Mother looked upset when he mentioned something called Whispering Creek. He took a deep breath. Were you there? Is that how you knew my father? The directness of the question reminded Caleb painfully of Robert Wilson. The lieutenant had never been one to dance around difficult subjects either. For a moment, Caleb considered deflection or a partial truth, but something in Noah's steady gaze demanded honesty. I was there, Caleb confirmed quietly. It was a bad day, one of the worst. Noah absorbed this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. And my father? Was he truly a hero like the marshal implied? Caleb met the boy's eyes directly. Your father saved lives that day, including mine. Whatever else happened, remember that. Noah nodded slowly, some tension easing from his shoulders. Thank you for telling me the truth. He hesitated, then added, there's something else. I found something of my father's. Something I think you should see. Before Caleb could ask what he meant, the kitchen door opened and Eleanor appeared, her expression shifting to surprise at finding her son in private conversation with Caleb. Noah, the twins need help bringing in more firewood. Her gaze moved between them, sensing the seriousness of their interrupted discussion. Is everything all right? Yes, Mother, Noah replied, though he cast a significant glance at Caleb before leaving. Just asking Mr. Sullivan about the horses. Eleanor watched him go, then turned to Caleb, her perceptive eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't asking about horses, was he? No, Caleb admitted. He wanted to know about his father, about Whispering Creek. Eleanor's composure faltered for the first time since her arrival. I see. She moved further into the kitchen, closing the door behind her. And what did you tell him? The truth, that his father was a hero that day. Caleb held her gaze steadily, that he saved lives, including mine. Eleanor studied him, her gray eyes searching his face as if trying to read the full story written there. Robert never spoke much about his military service, especially not about battles or skirmishes. He said those memories were best left in the past. She hesitated, then asked directly, what happened at Whispering Creek, Mr. Sullivan? What aren't you telling me? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Caleb wasn't sure Eleanor fully understood. Before he could formulate a response, the sound of breaking glass followed by a child's cry interrupted them. Eleanor was in motion instantly, maternal instinct overriding all other concerns. Caleb followed her into the main room, to find Sophie standing amid the shards of a broken lamp, tears streaming down her face. "I was just trying to help," the little girl sobbed as Eleanor knelt beside her, carefully checking for injuries. "I wanted to carry it to Deputy Chapman's room because Emma said he needed more light." "Shh, it's all right," Eleanor soothed, gathering her daughter into her arms and lifting her away from the broken glass. "No harm done, sweetheart. It was an accident." Caleb retrieved a broom and dustpan, sweeping up the shards as Eleanor comforted Sophie. The moment for revelations had passed, at least for now, but he knew the question would return. Eleanor Wilson was not a woman to leave mysteries unresolved, especially those concerning her late husband. The interruption was perhaps fortunate, Caleb reflected, as he disposed of the broken glass. How could he explain Whispering Creek to her? How could he tell her that Robert Wilson had saved his life? Yes, but only after Caleb's faulty intelligence had led their patrol into a deadly ambush. That 5 men had died because of his error, while Robert had received a commendation for bravery in evacuating the survivors. Some truths were better left buried in the past, like the bodies of those 5 soldiers in the lonely cemetery at Fort McKenzie. Night fell early, hastened by the continuing storm that showed no sign of abating. The house settled into an uneasy routine centered around the care of Deputy Chapman, whose condition remained serious but had stabilized under Eleanor's capable management. The Wilson children, subdued by the presence of illness in the house, retired early, though Noah cast several meaningful glances at Caleb that suggested their interrupted conversation was far from concluded. Caleb's watch over Chapman came in the darkest hours, from midnight until 2. The young deputy drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring incoherently as Caleb adjusted blankets and checked his temperature. The fever that typically followed severe hypothermia had set in, and Caleb kept careful track of its progression, ready to wake Eleanor earlier than scheduled if necessary. Around 1 in the morning, as Caleb was stoking the fire in the study, a sound at the door made him turn. Noah stood there in his nightshirt, a folded paper clutched in his hand. "You should be asleep," Caleb said quietly, mindful of the deputy's rest. Noah approached anyway, his expression determined. "I couldn't, not with this." He held out the paper. "It was my father's. Mother doesn't know I have it. He gave it to me the day before he died, told me to keep it safe and only open it if we ever found ourselves in real trouble with nowhere else to turn." Caleb accepted the paper with a puzzled frown. "And you think now is that time?" Noah nodded, glancing toward the door as if to ensure they weren't overheard. "The marshal asking all those questions about father, about you. Something's not right. I think father knew this might happen someday, that we might need help, and that you might be the one to provide it." The boy's insight was uncomfortably accurate. Caleb unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a letter written in Robert Wilson's distinctive hand. The same neat, precise script Caleb remembered from military reports years ago. "To whom it may concern," the letter began formally, "this document confirms that my family, consisting of my wife Eleanor and our 5 children, are to be granted every consideration and protection by the bearer. In particular, I direct this letter to Caleb Sullivan, formerly of Fort McKenzie, to whom I entrust my family's safety should circumstances render me unable to provide it myself. Sullivan and I share a history that binds us more surely than blood. He knows the debt between us, forged at Whispering Creek, and I trust his honor to acknowledge and fulfill that obligation should the need arise. To my dear Eleanor, should you be reading this, I have not been entirely forthcoming about certain aspects of my military service, nor about the circumstances that may threaten you after my passing. Forgive me this deception, undertaken only to spare you worry during our time together. Know that Caleb Sullivan is a man of integrity, despite what the official record may suggest about the events at Whispering Creek. Trust him with your life and the lives of our children, as I would. Lieutenant Robert Wilson, 7th Cavalry Regiment." The letter was dated just 1 week before Robert's death, as if he had sensed his time was growing short. Caleb read it twice, his hands unsteady as he absorbed the implications. Robert had known he was dying, had anticipated threats to his family, and had deliberately directed them to Caleb, the man whose error had nearly cost him his life. "What does it mean?" Noah asked, watching Caleb's face closely. "What was Whispering Creek, and why would father think we'd need your protection?" Caleb carefully refolded the letter, buying time to organize his thoughts. Whispering Creek was a battle that went wrong, he said finally. Your father saved many lives that day, including mine. He hesitated, then added, as for the rest, I'm not sure. Your father had many duties in the military, some of them confidential. It's possible he made enemies we know nothing about. Noah's expression suggested he knew Caleb wasn't telling the whole truth, but he didn't press further. Will you help us if the marshal decides Mother is this bank robber he's looking for? The weight of Robert's letter seemed to burn in Caleb's hand. I'll help you, he promised, whatever it takes. Relief softened Noah's young face. I knew you would. Father always said you could judge a man by how he responds when there's nothing in it for him. The assessment, so typical of Robert's straightforward values, struck Caleb with unexpected force. Had Robert truly held him in such esteem, despite Whispering Creek? Despite the official report that had protected Caleb's reputation at the expense of full disclosure? You should get some rest, Caleb said, tucking the letter into his shirt pocket. Your mother will worry if she finds you up at this hour. Noah nodded, though he lingered a moment longer. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for helping us and for not treating me like a child. Father always said a boy becomes a man when he starts shouldering a man's burdens. As Noah slipped quietly from the room, Caleb turned back to the fire, Robert's words echoing in his mind. He knows the debt between us, forged at Whispering Creek. The debt was real, but not in the way Noah imagined, not in the way Eleanor might assume from reading the letter. The debt was Caleb's to pay, for the lives lost due to his error, for the commendation Robert had ensured he received despite his mistake, for the chance to continue his career when by rights he should have been discharged in disgrace. Robert had protected him then, testifying that the intelligence failure was unavoidable rather than the result of Caleb's overconfidence. And now, from beyond the grave, Robert was asking for repayment, protection for his family against threats he had anticipated but not specified. The study door opened again, this time revealing Eleanor, wrapped in a shawl over her nightdress, her hair in a long braid down her back. I thought I heard voices, she said quietly, glancing at the sleeping deputy. Is everything all right? Caleb nodded, acutely aware of Robert's letter pressed against his chest. Noah couldn't sleep, came to check on our patient. Eleanor's expression softened with maternal pride. He takes his responsibilities so seriously. Too seriously for a boy his age sometimes. She approached the bed, her practiced hands checking Chapman's temperature and adjusting his blankets. The fever's rising, she observed. Not dangerous yet, but we'll need to watch him carefully. I'll wake you if there's any significant change, Caleb assured her. Eleanor straightened, studying him with those perceptive gray eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. You look troubled, Mr. Sullivan. More so than our current difficulties would explain. Caleb turned back to the fire, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. Just tired. It's been a long day. Yes, it has. She moved to stand beside him, the firelight casting a warm glow on her features. But I think there's more. Something about my husband, about this Whispering Creek that the marshal mentioned. She hesitated, then asked directly, What aren't you telling me, Mr. Sullivan? The question hung in the air between them, impossible to evade a second time. Caleb weighed his options carefully, aware that the wrong words could shatter the fragile trust that had begun to develop between them. Whispering Creek is a reconnaissance mission that turned into an ambush, he said finally, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing Chapman. I was the scout for the patrol. Lieutenant Wilson was commanding officer. Eleanor nodded, encouraging him to continue. And something went wrong. Everything went wrong, Caleb corrected grimly. We were surrounded before we knew what was happening. 5 men died in the first volley. He stared into the fire, seeing not the flames but the blood-soaked creek bed of 7 years ago. Your husband organized the defense, created a diversion that allowed the wounded to be evacuated. He received a commendation for bravery. And you? Eleanor asked softly. What was your role in all this? Caleb met her eyes, finding himself unable to lie to her directly. I missed the signs of the ambush. Failed in my primary duty as scout. The deaths are on my conscience, if not on my official record. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's face. Robert protected you, in his report. He did. Caleb looked away, the admission painful even after so many years. Said the terrain made proper reconnaissance impossible, that no scout could have detected the ambush. It wasn't true, but it saved my career. Maybe my life, given how I was afterwards. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than accusatory. That sounds like Robert. He believed in second chances, in judging a man by his whole character rather than his worst mistake. She studied Caleb's face in the firelight. He must have seen something in you worth saving, Mr. Sullivan. The absence of condemnation in her voice was nearly as painful as accusation would have been. He was a better man than me, Caleb said quietly. Always was. Eleanor's hand touched his arm lightly, the gesture unexpected and deeply affecting. Robert wasn't perfect. Whatever you may believe, he had his flaws, his regrets, but he was a good judge of character. Her gaze was steady, compassionate rather than pitying. If he believed in you, there was reason. Caleb found himself unable to respond, the simple touch of her hand on his arm somehow more intimate than any embrace. Eleanor seemed to sense his discomfort, withdrawing her hand after a moment. I should check on the children, she said, moving toward the door. Wake me in an hour for my shift with Deputy Chapman. Eleanor, Caleb said impulsively, stopping her. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it hung in the air between them. There's something else you should know, about Robert, about why you're here. She turned back, a question in her eyes, but before Caleb could continue, a new sound interrupted them. The distant but unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, carried on the howling wind. Both froze, listening intently. For a moment, Caleb thought he might have imagined it, but then it came again, another shot, closer this time. Someone's out there, Eleanor whispered, her face pale in the firelight. In the storm. Caleb moved quickly to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain to peer out into the darkness. The snow continued to fall heavily, obscuring visibility beyond a few yards. But as he watched, a faint light appeared in the distance. A lantern, bobbing through the storm toward the ranch house. Wake Gabriel, Caleb instructed, already reaching for his gun belt. Keep the children quiet and away from the windows. Eleanor nodded, her momentary fear replaced by composed determination. Be careful, she said simply, and then she was gone, moving silently down the hallway to alert the marshal. Caleb checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded before making his way to the front door. Through the window beside it, he could see the lantern growing closer, now accompanied by dark shapes, riders struggling through the deep snow toward the house. Gabriel appeared beside him, his own weapon ready. How many? The marshal asked quietly. At least 3, maybe more, Caleb replied, armed, judging by those shots. Could be lost travelers, Gabriel suggested, though his tone indicated he believed otherwise. In this storm? Heading directly for the only house for 20 miles? Caleb shook his head. They know where they're going. Eleanor returned from checking on her children, her face tight with controlled fear. The children are in the back bedroom with Samuel. He's armed. She hesitated, then asked, who would be out in this weather, looking for us? Gabriel's gaze sharpened. Us, Mrs. Wilson, or you specifically? Before she could respond, another shot rang out, this one striking the front door with enough force to splinter the wood. Caleb pulled Eleanor away from the windows, positioning her behind the solid protection of the stone fireplace. Get back to the children, he ordered. Barricade the door, and don't open it unless you hear my voice. Eleanor looked as if she might argue, but nodded instead, gathering her skirts and moving swiftly down the hallway toward the back bedroom. Caleb and Gabriel took up positions on either side of the front window, careful to remain hidden from outside view. The lantern had stopped moving, now stationary about 50 yards from the house. Dark figures surrounded it, their exact number impossible to determine in the swirling snow. Sullivan, a woman's voice called, carrying clearly through the storm. We know you're harboring Victoria Blackwood. Send her out, and the rest of you can live. Caleb and Gabriel exchanged puzzled glances. Victoria Blackwood? Gabriel murmured. The name doesn't match our bank robber. Eleanor Wilson, Caleb corrected. That's the name on your wanted poster. Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Someone's confused. Or lying. Or both, Caleb suggested. The woman's voice came again, more insistent. You have 5 minutes to send her out, Sullivan. After that, we start shooting to kill. Gabriel moved to the door, keeping well to the side of the window. This is Federal Marshal Gabriel Hayes, he called. You're threatening a federal officer. Lower your weapons and identify yourselves. A burst of gunfire was the only response, bullets thudding into the door and walls of the ranch house. Caleb pulled Gabriel away from the window as glass shattered, sending shards flying across the room. So much for negotiation, the marshal muttered, brushing glass from his coat. We're outnumbered and pinned down, Caleb assessed grimly, and we have women and children to protect. Gabriel nodded, his expression hardening into the focused determination Caleb remembered from their military days. We need to know who we're dealing with and what they want with a woman they're calling Victoria Blackwood. The name tickled something in Caleb's memory, a detail from Gabriel's earlier conversation, or perhaps from the wanted poster he'd shown him. The bank robbery, he said slowly. You said it was 4 men and a woman. Was Victoria Blackwood one of the names mentioned by witnesses? Gabriel's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Yes, one teller thought he heard that name, but the majority said Eleanor Wilson, so that's what went on the poster. He shook his head, pieces falling into place. They're after the same woman, Sullivan. But I'm starting to think neither of them is your house guest. Before Caleb could respond, Noah appeared in the hallway, his young face pale but determined. Mr. Sullivan, there are men trying to break in through the back porch. Gabriel cursed under his breath. They're surrounding us. Noah, get back to your mother, Caleb ordered, already moving toward the hallway. Tell Samuel to hold the back door. We're coming. The boy nodded and disappeared back down the hall. Caleb turned to Gabriel, their shared military experience allowing for rapid, wordless communication. The marshal would hold the front, while Caleb reinforced the back. Both understood the desperate nature of their situation, outnumbered, with civilians to protect, in a house that offered limited defensive positions. As Caleb hurried down the hallway, he heard a crash from the kitchen, the sound of the back door giving way under force. He quickened his pace, reaching the kitchen just as Samuel fired a warning shot through the broken door. Stay back, the old man shouted, his voice remarkably steady despite the danger. Next one won't be aimed at the ceiling. Caleb positioned himself beside Samuel, his own weapon trained on the doorway. Through the broken panel, he could see dark figures moving on the porch, their outlines blurred by the driving snow. How many? Caleb asked quietly. At least 3 that I can see, Samuel replied. Maybe more beyond the porch. A man's voice called from outside, hard-edged with threat. We know she's in there. Send out Victoria Blackwood, and we'll let the rest of you live. There's no Victoria Blackwood here, Caleb shouted back. You've got the wrong house. Liar! The accusation was followed by another volley of gunfire, bullets splintering what remained of the door and forcing Caleb and Samuel to duck behind the solid oak table they'd overturned for cover. In the brief lull that followed, Caleb heard a new commotion from the front of the house, Gabriel exchanging fire with the attackers there. The ranch house was under assault from multiple directions, their situation deteriorating rapidly. Samuel, Caleb said urgently, get to the cellar. There's access to the old tunnel from the barn. Take Mrs. Wilson and the children out that way while we hold them here. Samuel's weathered face creased with concern. And leave you and the marshal to face them alone? No, boss. I'm staying. Before Caleb could argue, Eleanor appeared in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the hallway, her face pale but composed. The children are hidden in the root cellar, she reported, but Sophie is missing. She must have slipped away during the confusion. Caleb's blood ran cold at the thought of the little girl lost somewhere in the house while bullets flew. When did you last see her? Just after the first shots, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. She was frightened by the noise and I thought she followed Emma to the cellar, but she took a shuddering breath. I need to find her. Stay here, Caleb ordered, already moving toward the hallway. Samuel, keep her safe. I'll find Sophie. As he moved cautiously through the house, Caleb could hear the battle continuing. Gabriel shouting warnings at the front, more shots being exchanged. The crash of breaking glass as windows were shattered by gunfire. The attackers seemed intent on forcing entry, their earlier ultimatum forgotten or merely a pretense. Caleb checked each room systematically, calling Sophie's name softly as he went. The study was empty except for Deputy Chapman, who had awakened in the chaos and was struggling to sit up despite his weakness. The main room was a battlefield of broken glass and splintered furniture, with Gabriel crouched by the front window, exchanging fire with unseen assailants. "Any sign of the girl?" the marshal asked tersely as Caleb passed. "Not yet," Caleb replied, his concern growing with each empty room. "How many out front?" "At least 4, Gabriel reported grimly, well armed and determined. "This isn't just about finding someone, Sullivan. They want to leave no witnesses." The implication was clear. These were the bank robbers, covering their tracks by eliminating anyone who might identify them, including, apparently, the woman they called Victoria Blackwood. A small sound from the direction of the barn entry caught Caleb's attention. A child's whimper, barely audible above the storm and gunfire. He moved quickly toward it, finding the connecting door to the barn slightly ajar, despite the weather. "Sophie," he called softly, pushing the door open wider. The barn beyond was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a lantern someone had left burning earlier. Among the shadows, Caleb could make out a small figure huddled beside the wild stallion's stall. Sophie, her nightdress white in the darkness, her face tear-stained and frightened. "Sophie," Caleb said with relief, moving carefully toward her. "Your mother's worried. Let's get you back to the house." The little girl looked up, her eyes wide with terror, but not at Caleb. She was looking past him, toward the barn door that led outside. Caleb turned quickly, his hand dropping to his revolver, but too late. A figure stood silhouetted in the open doorway, snow swirling around her, a rifle aimed directly at Caleb's chest. In the dim light, her features were hard to discern, but there was something familiar in the shape of her face, in the set of her shoulders. "Hello, Sullivan," the woman said, her voice cold as the storm outside. "I've come for what's mine." "Victoria Blackwood, I presume," Caleb replied, keeping his voice steady despite the rifle trained on him. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between the woman and Sophie. "You're making a mistake. There's a federal marshal in the house along with 2 deputies. Victoria laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "1 marshal against 6 of my men, and 2 deputies, one of them half dead from cold." She stepped further into the barn, revealing a face that bore an unsettling resemblance to Eleanor's, though harder, with none of the warmth or compassion. "No, Sullivan, you're the one making a mistake, harboring that woman. The only woman here is Eleanor Wilson and her daughters," Caleb said carefully. "And I think you know that's not who you're looking for." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Playing games? Fine. Call her whatever name she's using now. Lily, Eleanor, whatever. I want my share of the Helena Bank money, and I want it now." Behind him, Sophie whimpered again, drawing Victoria's attention. The woman's expression changed, a calculating look entering her eyes. Well, one of her precious children." Victoria gestured with the rifle. "Bring the brat here. We'll see if Eleanor values her child's life enough to produce my money." Caleb remained motionless, his mind racing. "There is no money," he said firmly. "The woman you're looking for isn't here. The real Eleanor Wilson and her children were stranded here by the storm. Nothing more." Doubt flickered across Victoria's face for the first time. "You expect me to believe that? After we tracked her from Denver? After she used my name in that bank job and took off with all the money?" The pieces suddenly fell into place in Caleb's mind. 2 women, similar in appearance, one of them a criminal who had used the other's identity as cover. A perfect scapegoat, especially if that scapegoat then conveniently disappeared. "You were partners," Caleb guessed, watching Victoria's reaction carefully. "You and this woman who looks like Eleanor Wilson. You robbed the bank together, but she double-crossed you, took all the money, and now you want revenge." Victoria's grip on the rifle tightened. "Smart man. Too smart for your own good." She glanced at Sophie again, her expression hardening. "Enough talk. Bring the child, or I shoot you where you stand." Caleb knew he had only seconds to act. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired, the shot going wide but forcing Victoria to dive for cover behind a stack of hay bales. Sophie screamed at the gunshot, and Caleb used the distraction to scoop her up with his free arm, retreating deeper into the barn. "Run back to the house through the connecting door," he instructed, setting the terrified child down behind the shelter of a grain bin. "Go straight to your mother." "Can you do that, Sophie?" The little girl nodded, her eyes huge with fear, but her chin set in determination that reminded Caleb powerfully of Eleanor. Go now, he urged, and Sophie darted away, her small form quickly disappearing through the door to the house. Victoria had recovered from her surprise and was firing at him from behind the hay bales, forcing Caleb to seek better cover. The wild stallion was kicking at its stall door, agitated by the gunfire and commotion, adding to the chaos in the confined space. As Caleb returned fire, he was acutely aware of his disadvantage. Victoria likely had reinforcements nearby, while he was alone with limited ammunition. His only advantage was his intimate knowledge of the barn's layout, including the tunnel that led from the far stall to the root cellar beneath the house, a relic from earlier, more dangerous days when the original homesteader had needed an escape route during Indian raids. A bullet splintered the post beside Caleb's head, showering him with wood fragments. He fired back, hearing Victoria curse as his shot came too close for comfort. The exchange had driven him steadily back toward the stallion's stall, where the agitated animal continued to kick and snort in distress. In the momentary lull as Victoria reloaded, Caleb made a desperate decision. He unlatched the stallion's stall, swinging the door wide open. The wild horse hesitated for just a moment, suspicious of the unexpected freedom, then bolted forward as another shot rang out. Victoria screamed as the powerful animal charged past her hiding place, knocking over the hay bales and continuing toward the open barn door. Caleb used the distraction to make his move, circling around behind Victoria as she struggled to extricate herself from the fallen hay. He aimed his revolver at her back, his finger steady on the trigger. Drop the rifle, he commanded. It's over. Victoria froze, then slowly turned her head to look at him, hatred burning in her eyes. You have no idea what you've done, she spat. They'll kill all of you now. My men won't stop until everyone in that house is dead. As if to punctuate her words, a fusillade of shots erupted from the direction of the house, followed by the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. The attack was intensifying, and Caleb knew time was running out for those inside. The rifle, he repeated, his voice hard with urgency. Now. Victoria hesitated, her calculating gaze measuring the distance between them, weighing her chances. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lowered the weapon to the ground. You're making a mistake, Sullivan, she said, her voice suddenly calm. I'm not your enemy. That woman in your house, she's the one who betrayed us all. Ask her about the real Eleanor Wilson, why don't you? Ask her what happened in Denver. Before Caleb could respond, a new voice spoke from the doorway connecting to the house. I believe I can answer that question, Mr. Sullivan. Eleanor stood framed in the doorway, a shotgun held competently in her hands, her gray eyes fixed on Victoria with a mixture of recognition and disgust. Hello, Victoria, she said coldly. It's been a long time. The barn fell silent save for the howling of the wind and the distant sound of gunfire from the house. Eleanor and Victoria faced each other across the space, two women connected by circumstance and separated by a moral chasm deeper than any physical distance. You know her? Caleb asked Eleanor, keeping his revolver trained on Victoria. Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. We met in Denver at the stage depot. She was using the name Lily Harrington then. Her gray eyes remained fixed on Victoria, who returned her gaze with undisguised hatred. She befriended me, asked many questions about my children, my destination. I thought she was simply being kind to a fellow traveler. Victoria's laugh was harsh. Kind? I was setting you up as the perfect scapegoat, you fool. A widow with 5 children, traveling west with no connections or protectors. Who would question when Eleanor Wilson suddenly appeared in Helena to rob a bank? Except the real Eleanor Wilson never arrived in Helena, Caleb surmised, the pieces falling into place. She came here instead, following Rebecca Mitchell's suggestion. Victoria's expression darkened. A complication I didn't anticipate. When you disappeared from the Denver-Helena stage route, I had to improvise. Used your name anyway, figuring a widow with children would be memorable to witnesses regardless of the details. And then what was your plan? Eleanor demanded, her voice tight with anger. Return to Kansas City and murder me and my children to eliminate any chance of contradiction? Nothing so dramatic, Victoria replied with chilling casualness. Simply ensure you never reached Helena, where your presence would raise awkward questions. Her eyes narrowed. But then you vanished. My men tracked you as far as the stage depot where you were supposed to change coaches for Helena, only to find you'd taken a different route entirely. It took us days to pick up your trail again." Caleb studied Victoria carefully, noting the similarities and differences between her and Eleanor. They were of similar height and build, with the same auburn hair, though Victoria's was a shade darker. At a distance, or to a witness under stress, they might indeed be mistaken for one another. But where Eleanor's face showed compassion and quiet strength, Victoria's features were hardened by cruelty and calculation. "Your partners don't know, do they?" Caleb asked. "That you plan to betray them too. Take all the money for yourself." Victoria's gaze flickered to him, then back to Eleanor. "Clever guess, Sullivan, too clever for your own good." "It wasn't a guess," Caleb replied. "You're here with only some of your gang. The others are still searching elsewhere, aren't they? You told them Eleanor Wilson had the money, sent them on a false trail while you came here alone to finish what you started." A crash from the direction of the house interrupted the confrontation. The sound of a door being broken down, followed by increased gunfire. Eleanor flinched but held her position, the shotgun never wavering from Victoria. "Your children are in danger," Victoria observed with cold satisfaction. "My men aren't known for their restraint. Every minute you waste here is a minute you're using to plan your escape," Caleb finished for her. "We need to end this now." He glanced at Eleanor. "Go back to the house. I'll handle her." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't know her, Mr. Sullivan. She's more dangerous than she appears." Her gaze remained fixed on Victoria. "Where are the others? How many men attacked the house?" Victoria smiled thinly. "Enough to ensure no one walks away alive." Caleb moved closer to Victoria, his expression hardening. "The marshal's deputies at Miller's Creek, they were attacked before we arrived, weren't they? Not victims of the storm at all." "Chapman was an unexpected bonus," Victoria confirmed with a shrug. "He separated from his partner, made himself an easy target. We left him for dead in the creek, assuming the cold would finish our work." The casual admission of attempted murder further cemented Caleb's assessment of Victoria as a woman without conscience or remorse. In her calculating eyes, he saw a willingness to destroy any life that stood between her and her goals. "Where's the money?" he demanded, pressing his advantage. "Your partners are dying out there for it. Where is it?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Victoria's face. "I don't have it," she admitted reluctantly. "Rafe double-crossed me, took the money and disappeared the night after the robbery. I've been tracking him while simultaneously searching for her or—" She jerked her head toward Eleanor. "To eliminate the loose ends." Another volley of gunfire from the house, closer now, suggested the attackers were making progress. Caleb knew they had little time left. "We need to get back," he told Eleanor. "They're breaking through." Eleanor nodded but kept the shotgun aimed at Victoria. "What do we do with her?" "Tie her up, leave her here until it's over," Caleb suggested, reaching for a coil of rope hanging on a nearby post. Victoria's eyes darted between them, then toward the open barn door where the storm still raged. In a sudden movement, she flung a handful of loose hay into Caleb's face and lunged for her discarded rifle. Eleanor fired instinctively, the shotgun blast deafening in the confined space. Victoria screamed as the shot caught her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing against the stall door. Caleb recovered quickly, his revolver once again trained on Victoria, who now slumped against the wooden boards, blood darkening the sleeve of her coat. "Don't move," he warned, though the fight seemed to have gone out of her for the moment. Eleanor approached cautiously, her face pale but determined as she kept the shotgun ready. "She needs medical attention," she observed, the compassion in her voice at odds with the firmness of her stance. "Later," Caleb replied tersely. "First we secure her, then deal with her friends." He quickly bound Victoria's hands with the rope, ignoring her gasps of pain as he tightened the knots. "Can you walk?" he asked her. Victoria glared up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of pain and hatred. "Go to hell, Sullivan." "After you," Caleb responded, hauling her to her feet. To Eleanor he said, "We'll take her through the connecting door. Better chance of reaching the others without being spotted." Eleanor nodded, her earlier hesitation gone now that direct action was required. "The children are in the root cellar with Samuel. Gabriel was holding the front when I left to find Sophie." Caleb secured Victoria to a support post, ensuring she couldn't escape but leaving her in a position where her wound could be tended later. "Let's go," he said, leading the way toward the house. "Stay close to me." The connecting door opened into the kitchen, which was now a chaos of overturned furniture and broken glass. The sounds of struggle came from the main room: shouted commands, the crack of gunfire, the crash of breaking objects. Gabriel was still holding his position, but the intensity of the sounds suggested he was now fighting a close-quarters battle. Caleb paused at the kitchen doorway, assessing the situation before exposing Eleanor to further danger. Through the doorway, he could see Gabriel crouched behind an overturned table, exchanging fire with at least two attackers who had gained entry through the shattered front window. "Sullivan!" Gabriel called, spotting him in the doorway. "About time! We've got at least four inside, more trying to break in through the study." Caleb glanced back at Eleanor. "Get to the cellar with the others. Stay there until I come for you." She hesitated, clearly torn between following his instruction and helping in the fight. "Noah has his father's revolver," she said quickly. "He knows how to use it. Samuel has his shotgun. If you can get to the cellar, we can hold them from there." Caleb nodded, understanding her plan. The root cellar had only one entrance, making it more defensible than their current scattered positions throughout the house. "Go, I'll bring Gabriel and cover your retreat." Eleanor disappeared down the hall toward the cellar entrance, moving with the quiet efficiency that continued to impress him. Caleb turned his attention back to the main room, where Gabriel was now running dangerously low on ammunition, judging by the decreasing frequency of his return fire. "Gabriel," Caleb called, "fall back to the cellar. I'll cover you." The marshal nodded grimly, understanding the tactical necessity without further explanation. As Caleb laid down covering fire, Gabriel made a crouching run across the room, reaching the hallway just as one of the attackers rose to pursue him. Caleb's well-aimed shot caught the man in the chest, dropping him where he stood. "Two down, at least three more inside," Gabriel reported as Caleb joined him in the hallway, plus however many are still outside. "Victoria Blackwood is secured in the barn," Caleb informed him as they retreated toward the cellar door. "Shot in the shoulder, but alive." Gabriel's eyebrows rose. "The real bank robber?" "The very same," Caleb confirmed. "And she's implicated her partners in the attempted murder of Chapman. They left him for dead in the creek." A crash from the direction of the study interrupted their conversation. The sound of more attackers forcing entry. Their time was running out. The cellar door was located in the floor of the pantry, accessible by a steep set of stairs that descended into the earth beneath the house. Caleb reached it first, flinging it open to find Samuel standing at the bottom, shotgun ready. "It's us, Samuel," he called down. "Coming in hot." Samuel lowered his weapon, relief evident on his weathered face. "Hurry, we heard them breaking in." Caleb motioned for Gabriel to descend first, then followed, pulling the heavy door closed behind them and sliding the iron bolt into place. It wouldn't hold forever against determined attackers, but it would buy them time. The root cellar was larger than might be expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the house above. Dug into the hillside years ago by the original homesteader, it served as both food storage and emergency shelter. Oil lamps provided dim illumination, revealing Eleanor and her children huddled in the far corner, with Noah standing protectively in front of his siblings, his father's revolver held in steady hands. "Thank God," Eleanor breathed as she saw Caleb and Gabriel safely arrived. Her eyes searched Caleb's face, asking the unspoken question about Victoria. "Secure in the barn," Caleb assured her quietly, though her friends are making themselves at home upstairs. As if to confirm his words, heavy footsteps sounded on the floorboards above, accompanied by shouted commands as the attackers searched the house. It would be only a matter of time before they discovered the cellar entrance. "There's another way out," Samuel said, gesturing toward a dark opening in the far wall, "the tunnel to the barn. Built it years ago as an escape route." He looked at Eleanor and the children with concern. "It's rough going, though, narrow and low. Not sure the little ones will manage easily." Caleb considered their options. The cellar was defensible, but ultimately a trap if the attackers discovered them. The tunnel offered escape, but would place them back in the barn where Victoria was secured, potentially into the arms of any of her partners who might be searching there. "How many rounds do we have left?" he asked, taking inventory of their dwindling ammunition. "6 in the revolver," Gabriel reported, "plus whatever Noah has." 5, Noah confirmed, his young voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Samuel held up his shotgun. 4 shells left. And I have 3 in this, Eleanor added, indicating the shotgun she still carried. Caleb nodded, calculating rapidly. Not enough for an extended defense, but perhaps enough for a strategic retreat. We'll use the tunnel, he decided. The storm's still raging. If we can reach the barn, we might be able to escape into the blizzard. They won't be able to track us in this weather. Gabriel frowned. That's risky, Sullivan. The children could freeze to death out there. We'll freeze either way if we stay, Eleanor interjected, her expression resolute. The house will get cold quickly with the windows broken. At least outside, we have a chance of reaching town. Caleb met her gaze, recognizing the courage it took for a mother to choose such a dangerous path for her children. We'll take the horses, he added. They'll provide warmth and speed. A heavy thud from above suggested the attackers were now systematically searching the house, moving furniture and checking for hiding places. Time was running out. Samuel, you know the tunnel best. Lead the way, Caleb instructed. Gabriel next, then Mrs. Wilson and the children. Noah and I will bring up the rear. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Caleb pulled Noah aside, speaking quietly so the younger children wouldn't overhear. Your father's letter, he said urgently. Did it mention anything about enemies he might have made? Anyone who might want to harm your family? Noah shook his head, his young face troubled. No specific names, just that there were dangerous men who might come looking for us after his death. The boy hesitated, then added, there was something else, though, something that didn't make sense at the time. He glanced toward his mother, ensuring she was occupied with the younger children before continuing. Father wrote that if we were ever in real trouble, I should ask you about the Helena connection, that you would understand. The phrase struck Caleb like a physical blow. The Helena connection, a notorious network of corrupt officials and businessmen that had operated in the Montana Territory years ago. Robert Wilson had been involved in a confidential investigation of the network during his later military career, an investigation that had resulted in several high-profile arrests, but had never fully dismantled the organization. Your father was a brave man, Caleb told Noah, the pieces finally falling into place. Braver than I ever knew. Before Noah could ask what he meant, a splintering sound from above indicated the attackers had found the cellar door and were attempting to break through. Samuel was already ushering Gabriel and Eleanor toward the tunnel entrance, the younger children wide-eyed with fear, but obediently following their mother's lead. Go, Caleb urged Noah, giving the boy a gentle push toward the others. Stay with your family. I'll be right behind you. As Noah reluctantly joined the evacuation, Caleb quickly reloaded his revolver with his few remaining rounds. The cellar door was beginning to give way under the attackers' efforts, the old wood creaking in protest. Samuel had disappeared into the tunnel, followed by Gabriel, who was now helping Eleanor guide the twins through the narrow opening. Emma went next, carrying a lamp to light their way, with Sophie following close behind, her small face pale but determined. Noah hesitated at the entrance, looking back at Caleb with concern. Go, Caleb repeated firmly. Your mother and siblings need you. The boy nodded reluctantly and entered the tunnel just as the cellar door finally gave way with a resounding crack. Caleb fired 2 quick shots through the opening, forcing the attackers to temporarily retreat, then dove into the tunnel himself, pulling the concealing boards into place behind him. The passage was exactly as Samuel had described, narrow, low-ceilinged, and roughly hewn from the earth. Caleb had to crouch to avoid hitting his head on the wooden supports that prevented the tunnel from collapsing. Ahead, he could see the bobbing light of Emma's lamp as the Wilson family made their way toward the barn, with Gabriel and Samuel leading the way. The tunnel seemed endless in the dim light, the air growing thick with dust disturbed by their passage. Sophie coughed, the sound echoing alarmingly in the confined space, and Caleb winced, hoping the noise wouldn't carry to any attackers who might have entered the barn. After what seemed an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upward, and Caleb could see a faint light ahead, the exit into the barn. Samuel had reached it first and was now cautiously peering out, his shotgun ready. Clear, the old man whispered back down the line. But Victoria's gone. Caleb cursed under his breath. Somehow she had managed to free herself despite her wounded shoulder, a development that complicated their already desperate situation. She would know about the tunnel and might have alerted her remaining partners. One by one, the party emerged into the barn, which appeared undisturbed, save for the bloodstain where Victoria had been secured. The wild stallion had not returned, but the other horses remained in their stalls, nervous but unharmed. Outside, the storm continued unabated, the wind driving snow against the barn walls with renewed fury. "We need to move quickly," Caleb told the others, already moving to saddle the most reliable horses. "They'll figure out where we've gone soon enough." Gabriel helped Eleanor lift Sophie onto one of the gentler mares, then assisted the twins onto another sturdy horse. Noah and Emma were capable enough to handle their own mounts, while Samuel, despite his age, was as comfortable on horseback as any of them. "The storm works in our favor," Gabriel observed as they prepared to depart. "They won't be able to track us easily." "But we'll have difficulty navigating," Eleanor countered, securing Sophie more firmly in front of her on the saddle. "How will we find our way to town in this blizzard?" Caleb finished saddling his own horse, a steady gelding that had carried him through difficult conditions before. "We don't head for town," he decided. "Too far in this weather, and they'll expect that. We head for the line cabin on the North Ridge instead. It's stocked with the supplies and firewood, and only Samuel and I know its location." Samuel nodded approval of the plan. "Smart thinking, boss. 6 miles due north, but sheltered from the worst of the storm once we reach the ridge." As they prepared to leave through the rear barn door, which opened away from the house and would provide some cover for their escape, a thought struck Caleb. "The deputy," he said suddenly. "Chapman's still in the house." Gabriel's expression darkened with concern. "He's in no condition to travel, but if we leave him—" "They'll kill him," Caleb finished grimly. "I've seen how Victoria and her gang operate. They leave no witnesses." A heavy silence fell over the group as they confronted the impossible choice before them. To attempt a rescue would risk all their lives, but to abandon the wounded deputy seemed equally unconscionable. "I'll go," Gabriel said finally, his decision clearly painful but firm. "Get the others to safety, Sullivan. I'll retrieve Chapman and follow your trail as best I can." "No," Caleb countered. "You know these people, their methods. You are needed to testify against them if we survive this. I'll go." "Neither of you should go alone," Eleanor interjected, her voice quiet but resolute. "The odds are better with two." Before Caleb could object, Noah stepped forward, his young face set in determined lines that reminded Caleb powerfully of Robert Wilson. "I'll go with Mr. Sullivan," the boy volunteered. "I know the house better than Marshal Hayes, and I'm smaller. I can move without being seen where he can't." "Absolutely not," Eleanor began, maternal protectiveness overriding all other considerations. But Noah stood his ground. "Father would go," he said simply. "He would never leave a wounded man behind." The invocation of Robert silenced Eleanor's objections, though the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. Caleb recognized the impossible position she was in, proud of her son's courage but terrified of losing him. "Noah stays with you," Caleb told her firmly. "I'll go alone. The rest of you start for the line cabin. If I'm not there by dawn with Chapman, continue to town when the storm breaks." Gabriel started to object, but Caleb cut him off with a raised hand. "This is my land, my responsibility. And I know every inch of that house in darkness." His gaze met Eleanor's, conveying without words his determination to protect her family. "Get them to safety, Gabriel. That's how you help me now." The marshal hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. 2 hours, Sullivan. If you're not at the cabin by then, we'll assume the worst." "Fair enough." Caleb checked his revolver one last time, ensuring it was fully loaded with his remaining ammunition. Eleanor approached him, her gray eyes filled with emotions too complex to name. "This is not your battle, Mr. Sullivan," she said softly. "You've already done more than we had any right to expect." Caleb thought of Robert's letter, of the debt he still owed to the man who had saved his career and possibly his life at Whispering Creek. "I made a promise," he replied simply, "to your husband, though he isn't here to hold me to it. I intend to keep that promise." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's face, followed by a gratitude that needed no verbal expression. Impulsively, she reached up and touched his cheek, a brief, gentle contact that conveyed more than words could have. "Be careful," she whispered. "Get your children to safety," Caleb responded. "I'll find you." The moment was broken by Samuel's urgent whisper from the door. "Riders approaching from the south," the old man reported. "Can't see how many in this storm, but they're coming fast." Caleb nodded. "Go now. I'll create a diversion to cover your escape." Gabriel began ushering the Wilson children toward the north door, where the horses were waiting. Eleanor lingered a moment longer, her eyes holding Caleb's in a look that contained a lifetime of unspoken emotions, then turned to follow her family. Alone in the barn, Caleb moved quickly to implement his plan. The hay stored in the loft was dry as tinder after months under roof and would burn with spectacular speed once ignited. It wasn't a decision made lightly. The barn represented years of work and significant investment, but weighed against the lives at stake, there was no real choice to make. Using a lantern, Caleb set fire to the hay in several locations, ensuring the blaze would spread rapidly. As the flames caught and began to grow, he made his way to the tunnel entrance, slipping back into the narrow passage just as the first shouts of alarm reached his ears from outside. The fire would serve multiple purposes, drawing Victoria's remaining men away from both the escaping family and the house where Chapman lay, while simultaneously destroying any tracks that might reveal the direction of their flight. It was a desperate gambit, but these were desperate times. The return journey through the tunnel seemed quicker, perhaps because Caleb was moving alone, or perhaps because urgency lent speed to his steps. He emerged into the root cellar to find it deserted, the broken door hanging from one hinge where the attackers had forced entry. Cautiously, he made his way up the stairs and into the house proper. The scene that greeted him was one of utter devastation. Furniture lay broken and scattered. Windows gaped open to the storm, allowing snow to drift across the wooden floors. Blood spatters on the walls testified to the violence that had occurred during the attack. The house was silent now, save for the howling of the wind through the broken windows. Victoria's men had apparently abandoned it to deal with the barn fire. Caleb moved silently through the wreckage toward the study where Chapman had been left. The door hung partially open, and as Caleb approached, he could hear labored breathing from within. The deputy was still alive. Pushing the door wider, Caleb entered to find Chapman propped against the wall beside the bed, a revolver clutched in his shaking hand. The young man's face was pale with fever and loss of blood from a fresh wound in his side. Apparently, he had put up a fight when Victoria's men discovered him. "Sullivan," Chapman croaked, lowering his weapon with visible relief. "Thought you were all dead." "Not yet," Caleb replied, kneeling beside him to assess his injuries. The hypothermia had weakened him significantly, and the new gunshot wound, while not immediately life-threatening, had cost him blood he couldn't afford to lose. "Can you walk with help?" Chapman nodded grimly. "If the alternative is staying here to die, I'll crawl if I have to." "Good man," Caleb helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as the deputy swayed unsteadily. "We need to move fast. The barn's burning, but that distraction won't last long." Together they made their slow way back toward the root cellar, Caleb constantly alert for any sign that Victoria's men had returned to the house. The yard outside was illuminated now by the growing inferno that had once been his barn, the light casting eerie, dancing shadows through the broken windows. They had just reached the cellar entrance when a voice spoke from the doorway behind them. "Going somewhere, Sullivan." Victoria Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, her wounded shoulder crude bandaged, but blood still seeping through the cloth. In her uninjured hand, she held a revolver aimed steadily at Caleb's back. "The others got away, I see," she continued, her voice tight with pain and anger. "No matter, my men will find them easily enough, once this inconvenient fire is controlled." Caleb turned slowly, keeping his body between Victoria and the wounded deputy. "It's over, Victoria. The marshal knows everything about the bank robbery, about your impersonation of Eleanor Wilson, about your attempted murder of his deputies. Even if you kill us now, you'll hang eventually." Victoria laughed, the sound brittle with desperation. "Perhaps, but I'll have the satisfaction of knowing you won't live to see it." Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. "You care for her, don't you? The widow Wilson? I saw it in your face at the barn." Caleb said nothing, but something in his expression must have confirmed Victoria's suspicion, for her smile widened with malicious satisfaction. How touching! The lonely rancher and the desperate widow finding comfort in each other's arms amidst the storm. She gestured with her revolver. Step away from the cellar entrance, Sullivan. I want to see your face when I kill you. Caleb complied slowly, his mind racing. Chapman was in no condition to help, and Victoria, despite her injury, had the advantage of the drawn weapon. His own revolver was holstered, impossible to reach without triggering an immediate response from Victoria. Why Eleanor Wilson, Mom? He asked, playing for time. Of all the people you could have framed, why her? Victoria shrugged her uninjured shoulder. Convenience mostly. A widow traveling with children creates a certain sympathy, makes people less suspicious. And she was heading west, away from any connections who might contradict the identification later. It was perfect until she disappeared from the stage route. And now, Caleb pressed, your plan has failed. The money's gone, taken by your partner, Rafe. The marshal knows the truth. What do you hope to accomplish by killing us? Satisfaction, Victoria replied coldly, and time to disappear before the law catches up with me. She raised her revolver, aiming directly at Caleb's chest. Goodbye, Sullivan. Give my regards to Lieutenant Wilson when you see him. The mention of Robert, clearly intended as a taunt, momentarily confused Caleb. How did Victoria know about his connection to Robert Wilson? Unless you knew him, Caleb said suddenly, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. You were part of the Helena connection, the corruption ring he was investigating before his death. Victoria's finger hesitated on the trigger, surprise flickering briefly in her eyes. Clever man, too clever by half. Her expression hardened. Wilson was a fool, thought he could dismantle an organization that had operated successfully for decades. He paid the price for his interference. You killed him, Caleb realized, a cold fury building within him. The fever Eleanor described, it wasn't natural at all. Slow-acting poison, Victoria confirmed with chilling pride. Untraceable, mimics the symptoms of several natural illnesses. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. Said Chapman had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. You're admitting to the murder of a federal witness, he said weakly. That's a hanging offense in any territory. Only if someone lives to report it, Victoria countered, her attention still focused on Caleb. And no one will. In that moment of divided attention, Caleb made his move. Driving forward with all the speed he could muster, he slammed into Victoria before she could squeeze the trigger. The revolver discharged, the bullet going wild as they crashed to the floor together. They struggled for control of the weapon, Victoria fighting with the desperate strength of someone who knew her life depended on the outcome. Despite her injured shoulder, she was remarkably strong, and Caleb found himself hard-pressed to maintain his advantage. The revolver caught between them, discharged again, the sound deafening in the confined space. Victoria gasped, her body going suddenly rigid, then limp. Caleb pushed himself away from her, breathing heavily, to find the front of her coat blooming red with blood. The bullet had struck her in the chest at point-blank range. Sullivan, she whispered, her voice already fading as life drained from her. You don't understand. What you've done, they'll never stop coming. The Helena connection doesn't forgive. Who? Caleb demanded, leaning closer to catch her fading words. Who sent you? Who killed Robert Wilson? But Victoria's eyes had already glazed over, her final breath escaping in a soft sigh that revealed nothing more. The secrets of the Helena connection died with her, leaving Caleb with more questions than answers. Chapman's weak voice broke the silence that followed. We need to go, Sullivan. Her men will have heard those shots. Caleb nodded, forcing himself back to the urgent present. Victoria was beyond justice now, but the living still needed his protection. He helped Chapman into the root cellar and through the tunnel, their progress painfully slow due to the deputy's weakened condition. When they emerged into the bitter cold where the barn had once stood, they found only smoldering ruins and swirling snow. The fire had burned with astonishing speed, leaving nothing but blackened timbers and the acrid smell of smoke that even the howling wind couldn't entirely disperse. North, Caleb said, supporting Chapman as they struggled through the deep snow. The line cabin is 6 miles north. The journey that followed tested the limits of human endurance. The storm, if anything, had intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet and driving the cold deep into their bones despite their heavy clothing. Chapman weakened steadily, requiring Caleb to practically carry him through snowdrifts that sometimes reached their waists. Time lost all meaning in the white emptiness that surrounded them. Caleb navigated by instinct and memory, having traversed this land countless times in all seasons. Still, doubt crept in as the hours passed with no sign of the ridge that marked the approach to the line cabin. Chapman had lapsed into semi-consciousness, his body temperature dropping dangerously despite Caleb's efforts to keep him moving. Caleb himself was nearing exhaustion, each step requiring conscious effort, but as cold and fatigue took their toll. When the dark outline of the ridge finally appeared through the swirling snow, Caleb nearly wept with relief. The line cabin lay just beyond, a small, sturdy structure built as a shelter for cowboys working the far reaches of the ranch. If Gabriel had followed his instructions, Eleanor and the others would be waiting there, safe from both the storm and Victoria's remaining men. The final approach to the cabin nearly defeated them. The ridge provided some shelter from the direct force of the wind, but the snow had drifted deeper here, creating an almost insurmountable barrier for two men already at the limits of their strength. Caleb was operating on pure will now, his body numb with cold, his mind focused only on the next step and then the next. Chapman had long since lost consciousness, a dead weight that Caleb refused to abandon despite the increasing temptation to do so. When the cabin door finally swung open, spilling golden lamplight onto the snow before him, Caleb wasn't immediately certain whether the vision was real or a hallucination born of desperate hope. It was Noah's voice calling his name with a mixture of disbelief and joy that convinced him he had truly reached sanctuary. Hands reached out to support him, to take Chapman's weight from his shoulders. Gabriel's voice gave brisk commands, Samuel's weathered face appeared in his field of vision, and then Eleanor was there, her gray eyes filled with tears as she helped guide him into the warmth of the cabin. "You made it," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. We'd almost given up hope. Caleb wanted to respond, to tell her about Victoria, about Robert's murder, and the Helena connection that had set these events in motion. But exhaustion claimed him first, darkness closing in as his body finally surrendered to the trials it had endured. His last conscious thought was of the promise he had made, to Robert, to Eleanor, to himself. A promise now fulfilled, whatever the cost. And Caleb awoke to the sound of quiet conversation and the crackle of a well-maintained fire. For a moment he couldn't place his surroundings, the rough-hewn log walls unfamiliar after his unconscious mind had expected the more finished interior of his ranch house. Memory returned gradually, the attack, the desperate escape through the blizzard, the line cabin emerging from the swirling snow, like a mirage made real. He attempted to sit up, only to find his body protesting every movement with the deep ache of muscles pushed beyond their limits. "Careful there," Samuel's voice advised from nearby. "You've been out for nearly a day." Caleb turned his head to find the old ranch hand seated beside the fire, whittling a piece of wood with the same calm precision he applied to all tasks. The familiar sight was strangely comforting after the chaos of recent events. "Chapman?" Caleb asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Alive, thanks to you," Samuel replied. "Though it was a close thing, Mrs. Wilson's been tending him round the clock." He gestured toward the far corner of the cabin, where a makeshift bed had been arranged. Caleb followed the gesture to see Eleanor seated beside the unconscious deputy, bathing his forehead with a cloth. Her profile in the firelight was serene, despite the exhaustion evident in the droop of her shoulders. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, her face brightening at the sight of him awake. She murmured something to Emma, who sat nearby, then rose and approached his bedside. "Welcome back," she said softly, her gray eyes warm with relief. "You had us worried." "The children?" Caleb asked, still taking inventory of their situation. "All safe," Eleanor assured him. "The twins and Sophie are sleeping. Noah's outside with the marshal, keeping watch." Caleb nodded, relieved that his gamble had paid off, that his sacrifice of the barn and nearly his life had secured the safety of Eleanor's family. "Victoria's dead," he reported quietly. "Shot during our struggle." Eleanor's expression revealed complex emotions, not satisfaction at the death of a woman who had threatened her family, but a sober acknowledgement of the justice in it. "The marshal told us you went back for Deputy Chapman. That was extraordinarily brave." Caleb looked away, uncomfortable with praise for what he considered simple duty. "Victoria confessed to your husband's murder," he said instead. "She was part of a criminal organization he was investigating, something called the Helena connection. She poisoned him to prevent his testimony. Eleanor sank onto the edge of his bed, her face pale with shock. Poisoned? But the doctors said fever, but her voice faltered as the implications registered. All this time, I thought it was natural causes, that at least his death was peaceful, if premature. Caleb reached for her hand without thinking, offering what comfort he could. Robert knew they were coming for him, he said gently. That's why he prepared the letter for Noah, why he made sure you would find your way to me. He was trying to protect you, even after he was gone. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes, though she seemed determined not to let them fall. He never told me, she whispered, about the investigation, about the danger. He carried it all alone. To protect you, Caleb repeated. He was that kind of man. Eleanor nodded, drawing a deep breath to compose herself. And what kind of man are you, Caleb Sullivan? She asked softly, using his given name for the first time. The kind who risked his life for a family of strangers because of a promise made years ago? Caleb found himself unable to look away from her searching gaze. Not strangers, he said finally. Not anymore. A small smile touched her lips, warming her eyes despite the sorrow that lingered there. No, she agreed. Not strangers at all. The door of the cabin opened then, admitting Gabriel and Noah in a swirl of cold air and snowflakes. The storm had abated somewhat, though from what Caleb could see beyond them, winter had firmly established its dominion over the landscape. Sullivan's awake, Samuel announced unnecessarily as the newcomers stomped snow from their boots. Noah's face lit up, and he hurried to Caleb's bedside, relief evident in every line of his young face. Mr. Sullivan, we were starting to think you might sleep forever. Caleb managed a smile for the boy who had shown such remarkable courage throughout their ordeal. Takes more than a blizzard to keep me down, he assured him, though his aching body suggested otherwise. Gabriel approached more slowly, his weathered face serious despite the obvious relief in his eyes at seeing Caleb conscious. Good to see you back among the living, the marshal said. You had us worried there for a while. Chapman? Caleb asked, nodding toward the deputy's still form. Holding his own, Gabriel replied. Thanks to you. That was a damn fool thing you did. Going back for him alone? Brave, but damn foolish. Worked out, didn't it? Caleb countered with a weak attempt at humor. Gabriel's expression softened slightly. That it did, and I won't forget it. He glanced at Eleanor, then back at Caleb. Mrs. Wilson's been filling me in on her husband's investigation into the Helena connection. Explains a lot about why Victoria's gang was so determined to eliminate witnesses. Caleb nodded. She admitted to poisoning Robert Wilson to prevent his testimony, said the Helena connection doesn't forgive. He frowned, remembering Victoria's final warning. She also implied they would keep coming, even with her gone. Gabriel's expression turned grim. Then we'll need to end this once and for all. Wilson's investigation materials, his evidence, it must still exist somewhere. With that, we could finally dismantle this organization. Robert kept records, Eleanor confirmed quietly. He never shared the details with me, but I knew he was documenting something important. After his death, I searched for his notes, thinking they might have financial value for the children's future, but they were gone from his writing desk. Hidden, perhaps, Gabriel suggested, somewhere he thought was safe. Noah had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity, his young face thoughtful. Father had a secret compartment in his saddle, he said suddenly. He showed it to me once, said it was where he kept things that needed to stay private. We still have the saddle. It's in storage with our other possessions in Kansas City. Gabriel's eyes lit with interest. That could be it. Wilson was smart. He would have ensured his evidence survived him, especially if he suspected his life was in danger. We need to retrieve that saddle, Caleb said, attempting to sit up again, despite the protest from his abused muscles. Before Victoria's associates realized its importance, Eleanor placed a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder, preventing him from rising. You're in no condition to travel, she admonished, and the storm is still too severe for any of us to attempt the journey to town, let alone Kansas City. Gabriel nodded agreement. She's right, Sullivan. We're all staying put until the weather breaks. I've sent Mercer to town for reinforcements as soon as the worst of the blizzard passed. He should reach there by nightfall if all goes well. Caleb subsided reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in their caution even as frustration gnawed at him. Every hour that passed was an hour in which the surviving members of Victoria's gang and their masters in the Helena connection could regroup and plan their next move. The children are safe for now, Eleanor said softly as if reading his thoughts. That's what matters most. Everything else can wait until you have recovered your strength. Her words eased something tight in Caleb's chest, a knot of responsibility and worry that had been his constant companion since the Wilson family first arrived at his door. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly believe that they might emerge from this nightmare intact, that the promise he had made to Robert Wilson might be fulfilled not just in letter but in spirit. Rest, Eleanor urged, her hand still warm on his shoulder. We'll need your strength in the days ahead. Caleb nodded, surrendering to the wisdom of her words and the comfort of her presence. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat, revealing a world transformed by snow and cold. Inside, the cabin remained a haven of warmth and safety, a small space carved from the wilderness where a disparate group of individuals had become something more, a makeshift family bound by shared danger and emerging trust. As Caleb drifted back towards sleep, lulled by the quiet conversations around him and the steady crackle of the fire, his last conscious thought was not of the danger still facing them, but of the woman whose quiet strength had become his anchor in the storm. Perhaps, when this was all over, they might build something together from the ashes of what each had lost. A new beginning, unexpected but no less precious for that. It was a hope worth holding on to, even in the darkest winter. 1 year later, spring came to Montana with its usual capricious nature, alternating between warm, golden days that hinted at summer's approach and sudden squalls that reminded all that winter never surrendered its dominion easily. The land around Pinewood Ranch was coming alive again, the harsh memories of the previous winter's blizzards softened by the emergence of new growth and the passage of time. Caleb stood on the newly rebuilt porch of his ranch house, watching as Noah expertly guided the wild stallion, no longer wild though still spirited, through a complex series of maneuvers in the corral. The boy had grown taller over the past year, his frame filling out with the muscle that came from steady work and good food. More importantly, the wariness that had once shadowed his eyes had given way to a quiet confidence that reminded Caleb powerfully of Robert Wilson. The months following the confrontation at the line cabin had brought significant changes to all their lives. Gabriel's reinforcements had arrived the day after the storm broke, bringing with them news that Victoria's remaining men had been captured attempting to flee the territory. The saddle Noah had mentioned proved to contain exactly what they had hoped. Robert Wilson's meticulously documented evidence against the Helena connection, including names, dates, and financial records that implicated several prominent territorial officials. The resulting investigation and arrests had dominated newspaper headlines for weeks, bringing to justice a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. Gabriel had been promoted for his role in breaking the case, though he made it clear in public statements that the true credit belonged to Lieutenant Robert Wilson, whose posthumous testimony had finally brought down the organization that had ordered his death. For the Wilson family, the resolution had brought both closure and a new beginning. Eleanor had declined the teaching position in Helena, choosing instead to remain at Pinewood Ranch where she and the children had found an unexpected home. The twins had thrived in the open spaces of the ranch, their boundless energy channeled into useful tasks and exploration. Emma had blossomed into a capable young woman who managed the household with growing confidence, while Sophie had recovered fully from her illness, becoming a sunbeam of energy and laughter that brightened everyone's days. As for Eleanor herself, "He's doing well with that horse," her voice came from behind him, warm with maternal pride. Robert would be amazed at how Noah's grown. Caleb turned to find her standing in the doorway, a basket of fresh-cut flowers in her arms, the first blooms of spring gathered to brighten the dinner table. The year had changed her too, softening the grief-etched lines around her eyes and bringing a healthy glow to her cheeks that spoke of renewed purpose and happiness. "He's a natural," Caleb agreed, moving aside so she could join him on the porch. "Reminds me of his father more each day." Eleanor smiled, setting her basket down on the small table beside the door. "In the best ways, yes, but I see your influence in him too, the patience, the careful consideration before action." She met his gaze directly, her gray eyes warm with affection. "You've been good for him, For all of us. Caleb felt a now familiar warmth spread through his chest at her words. The gradual transformation of their relationship from reluctant host and unexpected guest to something deeper and more profound had been one of the unexpected blessings of the past year. "You've been good for me, too," he replied, taking her hand in his. "All of you. I didn't realize how empty this place was until you filled it with life." Eleanor's fingers intertwined with his, a simple gesture that still had the power to affect him deeply. And to think it all began with a mail-order bride who changed her mind, she mused, her lips curving in a smile. Sometimes I wonder what became of Rebecca Mitchell. Married her timber merchant in Oregon, according to Gabriel's last letter, Caleb reported. Seems she found her happiness, just as we found ours. Eleanor's expression softened at his words, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "Are you happy, Caleb Sullivan? Truly?" The question was one she asked occasionally, as if still finding it difficult to believe that the tragedy and danger that had brought them together could ultimately lead to such contentment. Caleb understood her uncertainty. He sometimes felt it himself when he woke in the night, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar warmth of her beside him, by the sounds of children sleeping peacefully down the hall. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he assured her, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. "Happier than I deserve, perhaps." "Nonsense," Eleanor chided gently. "If anyone deserves happiness after all you've been through, it's you." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Samuel, who emerged from the barn leading a saddled horse. The old ranch hand had weathered the events of the past year with remarkable resilience, seeming almost rejuvenated by the presence of the Wilson children, who had adopted him as a surrogate grandfather. "Mail's here," Samuel announced, gesturing toward a distant dust cloud that marked the approach of the weekly stage. "And looks like we might have visitors, more than just the mail carrier on that stage." Caleb squinted against the spring sunlight, noting the unusual number of passengers visible on the approaching vehicle. "Strange, we weren't expecting anyone, were we?" Eleanor shook her head, a slight frown creasing her brow. Though the threat of the Helena connection had been eliminated, the memories of that terrible night when Victoria's gang that had attacked the ranch lingered. Unexpected visitors still prompted an initial wariness that perhaps would never entirely fade. "I'll ride down to meet them," Caleb decided, accepting the reins from Samuel. "You alert Gabriel, just in case." The marshal had taken up permanent residence in the small town that served as the local trading center, maintaining a vigilant presence despite the dismantling of the Helena connection. Some habits of caution, formed during their shared ordeal, died hard. As Caleb mounted and prepared to ride toward the approaching stage, Eleanor caught his arm. "Be careful," she said, the echo of words spoken a year ago during very different circumstances. "Always," he promised with a reassuring smile. The stage was closer now, the figures of the passengers more distinct. Caleb relaxed slightly as he recognized the driver, old Pete Johnson, who had been running the mail route for as long as anyone could remember. Pete wasn't the type to transport trouble willingly. Caleb rode down to intercept the stage at the main road, arriving just as it pulled to a stop at the junction that led to Pinewood Ranch. Pete touched his hat in greeting, a broad grin splitting his weathered face. "Special delivery for Pinewood," the old driver announced with evident satisfaction. "All the way from Washington, if you can believe it." The stage door swung open, and a distinguished-looking man in an impeccable suit descended, followed by a younger man carrying a leather portfolio. Both looked travel-worn, but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of government officials. "Mr. Sullivan?" the older man inquired, extending his hand. "William Archer, Department of Justice. This is my associate, Mr. Jenkins. We've come on a matter concerning Lieutenant Robert Wilson's service to the United States government." Caleb shook the offered hand, his wariness giving way to curiosity. "What sort of matter?" Archer's serious expression softened slightly. "A recognition of service long overdue, and a matter of compensation for his family." He glanced at the portfolio his associate carried. "Is Mrs. Wilson available? We have some documents that require her attention." "She's at the house," Caleb confirmed, still somewhat bemused by this unexpected development. "You're welcome to ride up with me." As the officials retrieved their baggage from the stage and prepared to accompany him to the ranch house, Caleb felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. Robert Wilson's final act of service, The evidence that had dismantled the Helena connection was being acknowledged at the highest levels. His family would receive the recognition and support they deserved. It was, Caleb reflected as he led the visitors toward home, a fitting epilogue to the promise he had made. A promise that had begun as an obligation to the past, but had transformed into something far more meaningful. A future built on courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love. Eleanor awaited them on the porch, her initial concern giving way to quiet dignity as Caleb explained the purpose of their visitors. Noah had joined her, the wild stallion now peacefully grazing in the corral, and the other children gathered around as word spread of the important visitors from Washington. As Archer formally presented Eleanor with a letter of commendation for Robert's service and explained the pension that would be provided for his family, Caleb stood slightly apart, watching the scene with a full heart. This was not his moment, but Robert's. A final acknowledgement of the man whose courage and foresight had saved not only his family but countless others from the corruption of the Helena connection. Yet when Eleanor looked up from the documents, her eyes immediately sought Caleb's, sharing this moment of vindication and closure with the man who had helped make it possible. In her gaze, he read all that remained unspoken between them. Gratitude, yes, but also the deeper connection that had grown from the seeds of tragedy into something enduring and true. The wild stallion, now tamed through Noah's patient efforts, approached the fence nearest the gathering, its proud head held high as it surveyed the scene. Like all of them, it had been transformed by the events of the past year. Not broken, but rather reshaped by experience into something stronger and more complete. As spring's sunshine bathed the ranch in golden light, Caleb Sullivan looked at the family that fate and circumstance had brought to his door, a family that had become his own through choices made and promises kept. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, with the strength that came from having weathered the worst storms and emerged intact. Some promises, once made, lasted a lifetime, and some, the most precious ones, extended even beyond, connecting past to future in an unbroken chain of honor, sacrifice, and love. For Caleb Sullivan, once a lonely rancher waiting for a mail-order bride who never arrived, that unintended chain of events had led to the greatest blessing of all, a home filled with love and a promise fulfilled in ways he could never have imagined.